Chapter 70. Fan Xian looked around and found that there was no one around, so he simply found a rock and sat down. He took the water bottle the old gardener handed him and drank a few mouthfuls, casually chatting with him about growing flowers and grass. He basically knew nothing about this area, so listening to the gardener's exuberant explanation was somewhat refreshing. However, after listening for a while he became a little annoyed. He wanted to leave, but when he thought of the poetry meet that was even more annoying, he gave up and sighed. Hearing the young master sigh, the gardener asked curiously, "Why aren't you happy? The poetry conference in the prince's manor is very boring." Fan Xian blinked at him, thinking that the gardener was only a servant, so there was no way he would be interested in the poetry conference. Sure enough, the gardener nodded solemnly. Reciting poetry is something only idle people do. It's not like they can earn a living. What a bunch of stupid pigs. Fan Xian was startled. Wasn't he scolding himself as well? Soon after, a thought flashed through his mind and he laughed out loud. "You really are a stupid pig." He finally understood some things and waved off the matter of reciting poems. After the poetry conference was over, everyone went home or ran away. As for what happened next, it was not until the next day that the news spread throughout the capital. That night, at King Jing's manor, the crown prince had planned to go to the Drunken Immortal Tavern to have some fun, but he was invited back by the old housekeeper. He sat uncomfortably at the table, waiting with his sister for their father's lecture. King Jing sat at the head of the table. It was the old gardener that Fan Xian had chatted with that afternoon in the nursery. He looked down at his arrogant son and cursed out of nowhere, "You stupid pig! You only go to those places every day." Crown Prince Li Hongqing knew that "stupid pig" was his father's catchphrase, so he did not get angry. He smiled bitterly. "Why are you angry today, father?" King Jing snorted but did not continue his outburst. He asked, "Did you have that poetry conference again today?" Li Hongqing was startled, then smiled bitterly. He knew that his father did not like the business of scholars, but he had to help the second prince win over scholars in the capital. To his surprise, King Jing did not get angry. Instead, he asked with interest, "There was a young man at the poetry conference today. He was wearing a light maroon robe. Whose family was he?" Li Hongqing thought to himself, "There are so many people here today, how can I remember all of them?" Imperial Prince Jing frowned as if he was thinking about that person's characteristics. After a while he said, "That lad is very pretty, like a girl." Li Hongqing chuckled. He knew who his father was talking about and quickly replied, "You must be talking about the one in Fan Manor." Imperial Prince Jing raised his eyebrows and revealed a hint of ferocity. He roared, "What? You say he's Fan Jian's son in Danzhou? Aleph *ck his mother. How could someone like Fan Jian have such a beautiful son?" Princess Rojia blushed when she heard her father swear. However, she was also very interested to see what kind of person the man that Ruoro treated like a teacher was. Li Hongqing looked at his father angrily, thinking that it was fortunate that there were no servants nearby. But then he thought about it and realized that the servants were used to King Jing's mouth. He quickly asked, "Father, why are you asking about the boy?" "What?" Imperial Prince Jing snorted. After running into Fan Xian in the afternoon, who didn't know who he was, he thought he looked familiar, but he couldn't quite place him. And because Fan Xian disliked poetry gatherings, he was able to listen to him talk about the arts that he was most proud of. But he didn't expect that the pretty boy was Fan Jian's son. Anger rose in his heart and he continued to lecture him. "You should learn from that. What's his name?" "Fan Xian." "Learn from Fan Xian. Don't be fooled by his unorthodox background, but he has good taste." King Jing sighed. He looked at his son and lectured him. "Fan Xian is able to talk to a gardener for half a day. You, on the other hand, are too proud of your status. You should know that being proud is not suitable for what you are doing right now." Crown Prince Li Hongqing knew that he was on good terms with the second prince. Of course, he couldn't hide it from his father, who was outwardly loyal and irascible, but was actually very astute. After the meal, the Crown Prince was about to return to his study to read in order to cheer his father up. Unexpectedly, King Jing said after a long pause, "Weren't you going to the Drunken Immortal Tavern?" The Drunken Immortal Tavern was not a restaurant but a brothel. The difference of one word was like the difference between heaven and earth. The Crown Prince's heart tightened, and he hurriedly said that he didn't dare. King Jing stared into his eyes and scolded him. "You're a man. If you want to go, then go. Don't be so irresponsible." Having said this, he called for someone to kick him out. Li Hongqing sat in the private room of the Drunken Immortal Tavern, holding the most popular courtesan in the capital, Yuan Meng. He was still thinking coldly about why his father had suddenly changed today. Late at night in King Jing's manor, King Jing drank and cursed. That son of a bitch loved to go to brothels, and he actually gave birth to such a beautiful child. I'll let my son go there as well so he can have a beautiful grandson in the future. Putting aside the matter of King Jing forcing his son to go to brothels, Fan Xian waited until the poetry meeting was over. He climbed into a sedan chair early and met up with Ting Zijing and a few guards. After the poetry meeting was over, everyone was talking about the Fan family's poem. Seeing the Fan Manor sedan chair, some scholars came up to bid farewell. Fan Xian hurriedly got down and sent them off with a smile. He then ordered the guards to take Ruoruo back to the manor. Before Ruoruo got into the sedan chair, she nodded to him. Fan Xian knew that the matter had been settled. His spirits lifted. He began to make arrangements for the evening. Guo Baoquan must be living in the manor of the Minister of State. He goes to the palace every 3 days or so. It's called editing, but in reality he's the Crown Prince's study companion. Fan Xian frowned. How old is the Crown Prince this year? He needs a study companion? The Crown Prince is the Empress's son. He's ranked 3rd among the princes and he's already 18 years old. Fan Xian laughed. Why would an 18-year-old need a study companion? Ting Zijing laughed bitterly. He's just having fun, so he's found some people to play with him. Does the emperor not care? I'm not sure. After what happened in the restaurant a few days ago, Fan Xian was worried that Guo Baoquan would not be able to swallow his anger and would do something underhanded. So he ordered Ting Zijing to investigate and found out where Guo Baoquan often went as well as the route he took home. At today's poetry meeting, Guo Baoquan's words were sharp. No matter how good Fan Xian's temperament was, he could only keep a smile on his face. Deep down he was still very angry. Only now did he realize that the reason he had asked Ting Zijing to investigate was because he was subconsciously prepared to bully Guo Baoquan, not because he was worried about being bullied. Chapter 71. What's the saying again? Fan Xian looked at Ting Zijing. Ting Zijing followed up quickly, I die. Nonsense, I get nothing out of your death. Of course I want someone else dead. You know what to do, right? Ting Zijing agreed without hesitation, even though he knew that beating Guo Baoquan in public would be a serious offense, not to mention Guo Baoquan's relationship with the Crown Prince. He was the son of a minister. If Count Sinan did not intervene, Ting Zijing, as the mastermind, would have to flee the capital for many years. But he still agreed without hesitation because he believed that by following this young man in front of him, he would definitely be able to escape from this kind of mediocre life in the future. This confidence came from many aspects, including young Master Fan's knowledge, manner of speaking and temperament, as well as Ting Zijing's intuition. Fan Xian nodded, very satisfied with his attitude, but said something strange, you don't know what to do. Ting Zijing was a little surprised, not understanding what the young master meant. I have to beat him, or else how can I vent my anger? Fan Xian smiled warmly, but this bright smile made Ting Zijing shiver as usual. But I have to think of how to beat him. Who will beat him? How can I beat him to my heart's content without worrying about being flogged by the authorities? Originally, I didn't want to dirty my hands by beating him up, but if you or your family guards beat him up, it won't be easy to talk to the officials in the future. I believe father won't offend the Guo family for a few servants. Fan Xian continued to explain with a smile, if I do it, my status is different and the consequences will be much lighter. The marriage between the Fan and Lin families is imminent, and father and the noblemen in the palace are determined to make it happen. They can't let anything happen to me. Ting Zijing frowned. Young master, you must not do it yourself. Besides, a fight between the nobles in the capital is a small matter. If you involve the master and Fan Manor support in the palace, it would be a bit. Ting Zijing stopped talking, but Fan Xian continued. A bit of a loss for a small gain? A bit of a mischief? He smiled and shook his head. I'm just saying if. In reality, I'm not going to beat him and then give him a chance to bite back. Ting Zijing felt a chill in his heart. Was this young master going to commit murder? Fan Xian guessed what he was thinking. He laughed and did not explain. Have you invited Crown Prince Jing? He asked. Please. Where should I book it? Drunken Immortal Residence. The name of this restaurant is quite elegant. Young master, this is a brothel. Fan Xian was taken aback. He forced a smile and agreed. Have you prepared the sacks? To the west of the capital was the Lujing River. Before this river flowed into the Tsang Mountains, it gradually slowed down, forming a large pool of water that was as clear as a mirror. Every night, many pleasure boats would travel casually on the surface of the lake. The boats were decorated with lanterns and streamers, and they were as dazzling as crystal palaces. It was extremely beautiful. The commoners all knew what they did for a living. However, as time went on, not many people would point fingers at them. The Drunken Immortal residence was not the largest of the brothels, but it was of the highest class. It was a two-story ship, exquisitely beautiful and elegantly decorated. Most importantly, it was the most popular girl in the capital's brothel scene, Sea Lily. Sea Lily's appearance and temperament went without saying. She was also skilled in the four arts of the zither, chess, calligraphy, and painting. She was also proficient in playing the zither, chess, calligraphy, and painting. Although she did not have much skill, she had earned a reputation as a talented woman from the capital's talented scholars, intentionally or otherwise. Of course, this was not the only reason that had allowed this girl to rise so quickly in the capital's show scene and become the center of attention. To a greater extent, it was because of a certain rumor. It was said that Lady Lily's surname was not Si, but Li, the surname of the royal family. The rumors in the Jianghu said that this girl was a descendant of the royal family at the beginning of the country, but because her ancestor had committed a major crime, she had fallen to this state. Those who truly understood the royal family would naturally scoff at such rumors. The common people actually knew that the news was definitely false, but Sea Lily never explained, so they simply went with the flow. In any case, His Majesty the Emperor would not care about the surname of a prostitute. This kind of mentality was actually easy to explain. Just think about the officials who worked in the court every day. If they knew that the wonderful person tossing and turning under them was a distant relative of His Majesty, they would probably be much happier. That was why the Drunken Immortal residence was very, very popular and very expensive, but it was still very lively every night. Who knew how many fools were willing to spend a lot of money to become Miss Lily's guest? But today it was a little strange. The pleasure boat was anchored by the shore, but those young masters were not allowed to board. A few fierce-looking men were guarding the gangplank, and they almost got into a conflict with those people. Fortunately, the madam came down to explain, and those young masters found out that the Drunken Immortal residence had been booked by someone today. How much would it cost to book the Drunken Immortal residence? The young masters, who loved to take advantage of the situation, left resentfully. They couldn't help but secretly curse the person who booked the Drunken Immortal residence for being a spendthrift. Fan Xian looked at the exquisite pastries on the table and drank the fine wine handed to him by a pair of slender hands. He really did feel like a spendthrift. Although the money had been paid by Teng Zijing from the accounts office of Count Sinan's manor, and although his father was in charge of the kingdom of Qing's money, the accounts office of Fan Manor was like a small account office of the kingdom of Qing. But when Fan Xian thought of the amount of money he would have to spend today, he still felt his heart ache. Furthermore, he didn't know how his father would react if he found out that he had used public money to visit a brothel, so he felt a little uneasy. The source of his uneasiness also came from the girl in his arms. Sea Lily's eyebrows were like willow leaves, and her dark eyes roamed about. Her lips were like painted vermilion, and when they gently opened and closed, they naturally revealed a kind of charm. Most importantly, sitting in Fan Xian's arms, every inch of her body made Fan Xian a little dazed. Feeling the heartbeat of the handsome young master beneath her getting faster and faster, Sea Lily secretly smiled. After confirming that the young master of Fan Manor was indeed a fledgling, she stopped teasing him and got out of his arms. She poured him a cup of wine, brought it to his lips and took a sip. Chapter 72. The boat slowly left the riverbank and the girl slowly left Fan Xian. Fan Xian let out a sigh of relief when he saw the soft, wonderful woman in his arms sit down next to him. After all, he had been a virgin for more than 30 years. Suddenly encountering this kind of stimulation was a bit unbearable. Seeing his expression, Sea Lily was a little curious. In this day and age, rich and powerful young masters like him would have fooled around with the servants in the manor at the age of 13 or 14. It was rare to see someone like him. She had no idea that Fan Xian had grown up in Danzhou and had only had a few servant girls. Donger, whom he had fantasized about, had long since married. Later, when he was about to fool around with Cici, he had been urgently summoned to the capital. Sea Lily looked at Fan Xian's handsome face, and for a moment she was lost in thought. She blushed and silently placed some food on his plate. This was the first time in his 2 lives that Fan Xian had entered a brothel, so he was a bit nervous. Naturally, he had no experience. Seeing that she was silent, he thought that the brothel girls of the kingdom of Qing served people in such a manner, so he said nothing. His left hand, whether intentionally or not, lingered on Sea Lily's waist. The atmosphere immediately warmed up. In another cabin, however, it was very lively. Teng Zijing was drinking with a few of his trusted subordinates. The brothel keeper stood to one side and asked if they wanted a girl to keep them company. The subordinates seemed to be tempted, but Teng Zijing coldly shook his head. They had been with the young master for a few days and had never had a chance to show off their skills. Today was a rare opportunity, and they refused to waste their time by drinking. Seeing his insistence, the brothel keeper did not insist. She had already given them the money, so she cheerfully poured them wine and chatted with them. The brothel keeper's surname was also Si, but it was obviously fake. Her first name was Ling, and she was no more than 30 years old. She was still attractive, and her words were quick and efficient. After a few cups of wine, she whispered in Teng Zijing's ear, "Sir, you are a handsome man. Which family do you work for?" This was obviously a probe, and Teng Zijing laughed. "When we made the reservation, we made it clear that our young master is the eldest son of Fan Manor." Si Ling smiled charmingly. The Fan clan is one of the 5 great clans of the capital. They don't have a dozen manors but at least 3 or 4 of the most luxurious. Teng Zijing chuckled but did not reply. Si Ling's heart skipped a beat and he probed, "Such a generous person it must be. Assistant Minister Fan's family?" Teng Zijing naturally would not deny that they were purposely going to the brothel today. He nodded. Si Ling was shocked. "So you are the son of Count Sinan?" She was still a little puzzled. Since he was the young master of Count Sinan, then the handsome young man sitting with her daughter in the rear cabin must be the illegitimate son of Fan Manor that everyone had been talking about recently. How could such an outsider's son command Fan Manor so much money? Of course she would not ask these questions. She only smiled and thought to herself. Back when she was grooming her cage and receiving guests, she had heard from her elder sisters that Count Sinan Fanjian was a frequent visitor to the brothels of the capital. Even after his marriage he would often linger on the river. Even the censors had repeatedly submitted memorials to censure him. But because of his friendship with His Majesty, there was nothing they could do. Who would have thought that after 20 years, Count Sinan's son would once again spend a fortune on flowers? When she saw the young master of the Fan family, she knew that he was a beginner in this field. Si Ling secretly sighed in admiration. This was his first time seeking pleasure, and he had found the most popular girl in his family. This was truly a family tradition. As they spoke, a few red lanterns suddenly appeared on the riverbank. It seemed that someone was shouting something in their direction. The madam stood up, somewhat hesitant. Teng Zijing's eyes were sharp, and he immediately recognized the guards of King Jing's manor. He quickly ordered the pleasure boat to approach the riverbank to receive them. After Crown Prince Jing boarded the ship, he naturally went to the rear cabin. Si Ling's brothel keeper was shocked when she saw him. Why did they invite this young master? It seemed that young Master Fan in the rear cabin had quite a bit of influence. The Crown Prince's guards were familiar with Teng Zijing and went to drink. In the rear cabin, Crown Prince Jing saw Fan Xian's frightened expression and couldn't help but mock him. "Miss Lily isn't going to eat people. Why are you hiding so far away?" Fan Xian thought that if he hadn't come, he would have started eating people. "Why did you come so late, Crown Prince?" Crown Prince Jing Li Hongqing was startled. Was he supposed to tell him that his father had taught him a lesson because of him? He chuckled. "You're from Danzhou, so you don't know the rules of the capital. You usually come out to enjoy the night view after you've finished eating at home." Enjoying the night view was a clever phrase, but there were no such rules. Fan Xian knew that, but he didn't expose him. He smiled and drank with him. Strangely, he and Crown Prince Jing had only met 3 times including this time, but both of them felt that their temperaments were somewhat compatible. Crown Prince Jing didn't have the domineering air of a relative of the royal family, and Fan Xian wasn't as vulgar as other nobles. He was free and at ease in front of Crown Prince Jing, which suited Li Hongqing's temperament perfectly. After a few cups of wine, the two of them became familiar with each other. The Crown Prince seemed to be very interested in his life in Danzhou, and Fan Xian picked out a few things that weren't so strange, such as the mirage. There was only Si Lily in the room and she was a little restless. She didn't know who to serve. Although she knew that young Master Fan had paid for the boat, Crown Prince Jing's status was so noble. What if young Master Fan wanted her to serve the Crown Prince? Li Hongqing looked at the girl with a smile. Although he often hung out in brothels, he had seen Lily before. Unfortunately, he hadn't had anything to do with her. Seeing her troubled expression, although he knew that she was deliberately pretending to be wronged, his heart softened. He motioned for her to sit next to Fan Xian. Of course, the procuress wouldn't let the Crown Prince just sit there. She had already invited a girl from a nearby pleasure boat. Her name was Yuan Meng, and she was also a very popular courtesan on Lujing River. She and Sea Lily sat at the small table, one on the left and the other on the right. They were a fitting match for the Crown Prince and young Master Fan. As the wine grew stronger and the night grew darker, Crown Prince Jing and Fan Xian grew closer. They were both very satisfied with this meeting. Seeing the bright moon in the sky shift, the two looked at each other and smiled. They each took their beauties back to their cabins. The red candles gradually lit up. Sea Lily's eyes were like silk. She gently leaned against Fan Xian's chest, her fingers gently tickling his palm. Her breath was like orchids. Fan Xian calmly took out a wax pill from his sleeve and gently crushed it. Sea Lily smiled and fell asleep. The cabin was filled with the fragrance of the knockout drug. Chapter 73. The pleasure boat stopped by the shore. Crown Prince Jing stood by the side of the boat, smiling as he watched the group disappear into the night. Yuan Ming was in his arms. "Where did Master Fan go?" she asked curiously. The Crown Prince tapped the tip of her cold nose. "You still want to pretend to be innocent in front of me?" Yuan Ming smiled sweetly. "No matter what Master Fan went to do, he didn't hide it from you. I'm afraid Sea Lily doesn't know anything." "He didn't hide it from me. That means he's smart." Li Hongqing smiled. "I'm just a shield he pulled along. But if he wants me to do it willingly, he can't hide it from me." He suddenly asked, "What do you think Fan Xian thinks of Sea Lily?" Yuan Ming seemed to be very familiar with the Crown Prince. After thinking for a moment, she replied, "Master Fan seems to like Sea Lily very much. I just didn't expect him to be able to endure this unrequited love and go do something else." She covered her mouth and laughed. It was completely different from her usual demeanor. "Then you should keep in touch with Sea Lily. Perhaps Fan Xian will come to the Drunken Immortal Tavern often." Li Hongqing frowned. "Yes." Yuan Ming agreed like a subordinate. She was curious as to why the Crown Prince was so interested in Fan Xian. Li Hongqing put his hand into her clothes. Yuan Ming let out a soft cry. Her body almost went limp. "Do you know who Fan Xian is?" "He's the favorite illegitimate son of Minister Fan Jian of the Ministry of Revenue." Yuan Ming's voice was like a kitten's, but her eyes were very clear. "I understand. You want to control the kingdom of Qing's money." Li Hongqing smiled and shook his head. "I don't have that ambition. I just think Fan Xian is a friend worth making." What he said was true, but there were some things he didn't make clear. Li Hongqing knew about Fan Lin's secret marriage, so he knew that the young man named Fan Xian would one day manage the huge business system behind the royal family. If the second prince wanted to compete with the Crown Prince, then money was the most important weapon. Guo Baoquan was at a disadvantage at the poetry meet and was in a very bad mood. That was why he went to a party at night to ease his mood a little. Once he thought of his old-fashioned father at home, his mood became bad again. Just as he was planning what fun things to bring to the palace for the Crown Prince the next day, he noticed that the sedan had stopped. He wasn't prepared for it and he didn't know why, but his head was a little dizzy. His forehead bumped into the front and it hurt. He angrily cursed, "You bastards, how can you carry the palanquin?" No one answered him. It was quiet outside the sedan chair. Guo Baoquan awkwardly climbed out of the almost toppled sedan chair and found that the street was quiet. It was Nyolan Street, which he had to pass before returning to the mansion. There were 3 masked men in black surrounding the sedan chair, and the Guo residence's sedan chair bearers and guards were already lying on the ground. It was unknown whether they were dead or alive. Guo Baoquan thought he had run into thieves who were robbing him along the way and was scared half to death. When did the security in the capital become so bad? Trembling, he shouted, "Who are you? What do you want?" Nyolan Street had always been quiet, especially at night. There were basically no pedestrians and Guo Baoquan felt a little hopeless. He didn't expect anyone to come and save him by shouting, so he kept his voice low. A clear and gentle voice answered, "I'm Fan Xian and I want to hit you." Guo Baoquan turned his head in shock, only to find a gunny sack flying toward him and covering him, so he didn't see Fan Xian's hateful smiling face. There was a faint fragrance in the gunny sack, but it caused Guo Baoquan's dizzy mind to sober up a lot. However, this made him even more miserable because what followed next was a torrential beating. Punches and kicks were actually merciless. Fan Xian watched Ting Zijing and the others beat him and felt a little pleased. He just wanted to let others know that they shouldn't try to provoke him so easily, but he also had other intentions. Guo Baoquan was the son of a minister, and he had never suffered such humiliation and pain. But he knew that it was Fan Xian who was beating him. In a fight between the sons of nobility, there was no possibility of killing. Knowing that he wouldn't lose his life, he spoke harshly. "Little bastard Fan. Beat me to death if you dare. Hearing this, Fan Xian was enraged. He waved his hand, motioning for Teng Zijing and the others, who had been beating him silently, to move aside. He walked over, squatted down and gave Guo Baoquan a good beating. Then he spoke softly to the rolling gunny sack. Brother Guo, do you know why I wrote that poem this afternoon? Fan Xian's strength was great, and Guo Baoquan was in so much pain that he couldn't speak and could only whimper. The wind is strong, the ape howls mournfully, the white bird flies back on the clear sand. Boundless trees rustle down, the endless river rolls in. 10,000 miles of sorrowful autumn is always a guest, 100 years of sickness alone on the stage. Hardship, bitterness, hatred and frost hairs on the temples. Destitute, new and cloudy wine cups. You've bullied me twice, so I'm going to beat you until you're sad and sickly. Otherwise, how can I be happy? As soon as he finished speaking, his fist smashed into Guo Baoquan's face through the gunny sack. He didn't know how he could be so accurate in the middle of the night, but he hit Guo Baoquan squarely on the bridge of his nose. Guo Baoquan felt a wave of pain, numbness and itchiness rush to his brain. Blood flowed and he couldn't help but wail and cry, begging for mercy. Fan Xian looked at the writhing gunny sack on the ground, and only then did he realize that his cruel and merciless side seemed to be slowly breaking free from the disguise he'd been hiding all these years. Still not satisfied, he kicked the gunny sack a few times, then waved his hand and led the 3 thugs behind him away into the night. He had come in a hurry and left in a hurry. Guo Baoquan hated not seeing him again. Half a day later, Guo Baoquan crawled out of the gunny sack, his body covered in bruises. Looking at the guards and sedan bearers lying on the ground, he couldn't help but curse and kick them up. Only now did he realize that his subordinates had been drugged, but that despicable Fan Xian had put the antidote in the gunny sack and beat him until he wished he were dead. The guards held Guo Baoquan's groggy head. Seeing their young master beaten into a pig's head, they were scared half to death. They rushed to help him up, not even sitting in the sedan, and carried him back to Guo Manor. That night, Guo Manor was in chaos. Early the next morning, Guo Baoquan sent someone to the capital government and handed the complaint to Mei Zhili, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Appointments and the capital government's magistrate. Mei Zhili complained about the previous night's tragedy, and swore that the bastards of Fan Manor would be punished with heavy crimes, and that the audacious bastard son of the Fan family would not be spared. If even Mei Zhili couldn't punish him, how could he, as a minister, face? Chapter 74. Sea Lily felt like she was having a beautiful dream. In her dream she had met her lover. They were doing that shameful thing under the candles and flowers. After a few rounds of it she slowly woke up. What she saw was a beautiful face that she had never seen before. Only then did she remember what had happened last night. The young master who had held her was the handsome Master Fan. But she felt a little strange. Had she drunk too much? How could she not remember those details? Thinking of this, she couldn't help but feel a little resentful. She knew that she had ultimately embarked on a path that she had always resisted. But when she thought of the memory of ecstasy that remained in her mind, she couldn't help but clamp her legs together and feel weak all over. Noticing that the man beside her had moved, Sea Lily hurriedly pretended to be asleep. When Fan Xian woke up and saw her sleeping face, he couldn't help but hold her in his arms for a while. Satisfied, he washed up and left the boat, his hands still full of her fragrance. After a while, Sea Lily opened her eyes and began to clean up the scene of last night's battle. She seemed to have discovered something, for she let out a shy and suspicious cry. When he left the pleasure boat, the sky was not yet bright. The crown prince was still sleeping in his room with Yuan Meng in his arms, so Fan Xian didn't say hello. He was in a hurry to leave because he had just arrived in the capital, and it wasn't convenient for him to sleep with a prostitute. Besides, the Guo family was about to make a fuss, so he prepared to go back to Fan Manor to watch the show. The reason why he didn't actually do anything with Lily last night was not because Fan Xian was a Taoist, but purely because of his mental and physical obsession with cleanliness. It was difficult for him to accept that another man had once touched a woman. In his previous life he had seen a lot of STD prevention billboards on the streets, so he had a deep fear of venereal diseases. There were no condoms in this world, so there was no harm in strolling around a brothel. If he really did anything it would be a little risky. But there were repercussions. Fan Xian looked at the indecent bulge in his clothes and sighed sadly. He regretted that he hadn't developed something with Cici while he was in Danzhou. When the sedan chair arrived at the corner gate of Fan Manor, the master and 3 servants sneakily called for the door to be opened. They slipped in and ordered the guard to keep quiet. Seeing that it was Ting Dai and the young master from Danzhou, the guard didn't dare interfere and went back to sleep. Fan Xian went back to his room to catch up on his sleep. When he woke up, it was already bright outside. He dragged his wooden clogs to the front yard and heard the noise. He guessed what had happened, but he pretended to be confused. That morning, Mei Zhili was sleepy in his study when he heard the sound of drums. He was angry and thought, where did these unruly people come from? How dare they disturb my rest? But the rules of the court were there, and he didn't dare to be negligent. He went to the court, and after a series of shouts, the advisor handed him the complaint. Mei Zhili's heart shook when he saw the complaint. Both the accuser and the defendant were not ordinary people. The accuser was Guo Baoquan, the only son of the Board of Rights Minister Guiyu. He was now a palace and had some fame. The defendant was Fan Xian, the son of Fan Jian, the Assistant Minister of Revenue. The accuser was Fan Xian's assault the previous night, provocation, and beating up an official of the court in the street. Seeing the two surnames on the complaint, Mei Zhili thought of retreating. The court was now divided into two factions. One supported the crown prince, and the other didn't reveal themselves, but secretly followed the second prince. Guiyu, the director of the Board of Rights, had been the crown prince's teacher, so naturally he was on the crown prince's side. Fan Jian, the assistant minister of revenue, didn't seem to have any inclination, but he had always been on good terms with King Jing, and everyone knew that Crown Prince Jing was on the second prince's side. The case looked simple, but if it wasn't handled well, the crown prince and the second prince's factions would attack. Mei Zhili secretly cursed Fan Xian for not knowing the gravity of the matter. Fan Xian's reputation was gradually becoming known in the capital. All the officials knew that he was the illegitimate son of Count Sinan, who had been raised in Danzhou. Mei Zhili thought to himself, you've been in Danzhou for a long time. How would you know how dangerous the capital is? You dared to assault someone on the street. I don't know how to deal with you. But the complaint was written clearly, and there were witnesses and material evidence. Mei Zhili had no choice but to delay. He looked at the complaint and frowned. He sent a document to Count Sinan's manor to arrest the people, while secretly sending someone to the Yamen of the Ministry of Revenue to inform Assistant Minister Fan. What Fan Xian saw was the bailiffs sent by the capital government to arrest the people. The Fan family had a close relationship with the royal family. For the past 10 years they had been the ones arresting people. There was no reason for him to be the one being arrested. So a dozen wooden sticks had been raised, and the servants and guards assumed the posture of loyal protectors, eyeing the poor bailiffs like tigers. At the front door of Fan Manor, the bailiffs had no choice but to say nice things. It was Fan Xian's wish to arrest the people. No matter how arrogant the Fan family was, they had to let the people go to the Yamen. Fan Xian smiled and was about to respond when he heard a young man yell, "Where did these lackeys come from? Beat them all." The one who dared to beat up the bailiffs was none other than the violent young master Fan Xizha. The servants and guards heard the young master's words and roared. They raised their sticks and bravely stepped forward. But they thought of the fact that the man was a bailiff, so they didn't really hit him. They just smashed the sticks on the ground to scare him away. The bailiffs were furious. They knew the man was not to be trifled with, so they didn't bring a single one of the chains. They didn't expect to meet such a miserable end. "What are you doing?" At that moment, Lady Lu walked out gracefully. She looked at the bailiffs and frowned. She ordered someone to invite them in to watch some tea, then glanced at Fan Xian. Fan Xian shrugged his shoulders innocently. In the reception pavilion, a few bailiffs looked at the madam uneasily. With their status, it was impossible for them to receive such treatment under normal circumstances. They understood why the Fan family was being so courteous. But it was also because of this that the tea they were drinking didn't taste good. If Lady Lu became angry, how were they going to survive in the capital? After finding out what had happened, Lady Lu frowned. "That doesn't sound right. Our young master has been studying at home ever since he came back from the poetry gathering at King Jing's manor. Nyolan Street is far from Fan Manor. How could it be our young master who beat up the son of the Guo family?" The bailiff said awkwardly, "Master Guo said it himself. Besides," he said in disbelief, "did Master Fan really stay at the manor yesterday?" Lady Lu's soft gaze suddenly became two small knives. She glared at the bailiffs. "Do you think the Fan family would lie?" The bailiffs jumped in fright and quickly shut his mouth. But he wouldn't leave just like that. After all, the plaintiff was still waiting in the court. Fan Xian sat quietly to one side, but he was surprised. He didn't know why Lady Lu was speaking up for him. He actually didn't understand the noble families of this era. No matter how fierce the internal strife within the family was, once a foreign enemy came in, These families would always put aside their internal strife and unite against the enemy. Lady Lu took a sip of tea. She knew that the bailiffs had no choice, and that there was no point in making things difficult for them. She smiled. If the Guo family says we beat him, then we beat him? The affairs of the world are all about reason and human feelings. You can't just say that if they send in a petition, we have to obediently go and accept it. Although the Fan Manor is not very rich or powerful, we still have some face in the capital. I'm just curious, who was the one who submitted the complaint to the magistrate office today? It was the steward of the Guo family. The bailiffs hurriedly replied, thinking that the Fan family wasn't wealthy enough. There weren't many wealthy families in the capital. It would have been better if he hadn't said anything, but when she heard that it was just a steward, Lady Lu's eyebrows furrowed. She slammed the table and scolded, "Calling a steward to hand over a petition, and you want our family to respond? Didn't you say that Master Guo was beaten? How badly was he beaten? If you want to file a complaint, then file it yourself. Otherwise, I'll have my steward go to the yamen every day to file a complaint. I'll accuse Guo Baoquan of using his power to bully people and take women. Whether or not my complaint is reasonable, you have to have Guo Baoquan wait in the yamen." Before she finished speaking, Lady Lu had already called out, "Housekeeper Su." Housekeeper Su knew what was going on and stood up. "Yes, sir." Lady Lu said coldly, "Tell Mr. Zheng to quickly write a dozen petitions. From tomorrow onwards, we will go to the capital government every day. Even if we don't scare the Guo family to death, we'll tire them out." That wasn't the end of it. She smiled and explained to the bailiffs, "Mr. Zheng is a guest of the manor, but I've heard that a few years ago he was your master's criminal lawyer. Writing petitions should be no problem for him." The guard thought to himself, "This isn't scaring the Guo family to death and exhausting the Guo family to death. This is obviously a plan to scare the capital government to death and exhaust the capital government to death." "Madam, please forgive me," he begged for mercy. "This matter, it's not something we can do." After Lady Lu's long speech, she felt her mouth go dry. She reached for a cup of tea, but found that Fan Xian was already holding it out to her with a smile. Their eyes met for a moment, then quickly looked away. The bailiff spread out his hands and begged, "Then what do you suggest we do?" Lady Lu thought for a moment. She knew that there had to be a solution to this, and that it wasn't a good idea to keep wasting time here. She said, "As for beating someone up, there is absolutely no way." Fan Xian added, "Absolutely not." Lady Lu continued, "The Fan Manor doesn't quite understand why the Guo family would accuse us." Fan Xian pretended to be deep in thought. "A few days ago there was a conflict in a restaurant, and that Mr. Guo suffered a little. Come to think of it, it was my fault." Lady Lu was surprised. "There was such a thing? Then it was your fault. But, could it be that Mr. Guo held a grudge and so he came to falsely accuse you?" Fan Xian frowned and replied, "Probably so." Chapter 75. The bailiff interrupted their crosstalk performance and laughed bitterly. "You can't be the first to say that. The Guo family's complaint clearly states that Master Fan held a grudge against them, which is why he blocked the street in the middle of the night." Lady Lu asked Fan Xian, "What happened in the restaurant?" "I broke the nose of one of their guards," Fan Xian said, blaming himself. "Are you all right?" "How could I be all right? Everyone in the restaurant saw it. I'm not one to be taken advantage of." Lady Lu sighed and turned to the bailiff. "Listen, if you hold a grudge, of course you're the one who's taken advantage of. Our young master took advantage of you, how could he still hold a grudge?" The bailiff had always been used to hearing litigators argue endlessly in court. He had never seen someone defend themselves before they even went to court. He was dumbfounded and didn't know what to say. Lady Lu extended her finger, and a banknote appeared in the bailiff's hand. He looked at it and his eyes shone. Lady Lu had regained the dignity and nobility of a wife. She said lightly, "We will go to the yamen. We want to see what the Guo family is up to. But we can't go now. Go back and tell Master Mei that when Master Guo goes to court, our people will go there to confront him." One of the bailiffs thought this was against the rules. How could they go back with a banknote when they came to arrest someone? He was about to say something, but he was stopped by the young man, who said yes and hurried out of Fan Manor. Fan Manor was finally quiet again. Aside from Lady Lu and Fan Xian, there was no one else in the reception hall. Fan Xian looked at Lady Lu with a smile, thinking that it would be great if she wasn't his enemy. He had seen her methods today and for some reason he admired her. Although Fan Manor was a large family, they had been ambushed by the Guo family, and his father was not there. Lady Lu was able to handle the situation clearly, and not be at a disadvantage was a small matter. The important thing was that she had bought a lot of time to deal with the situation. As expected, Madame Lu took a sip of tea and faintly asked, "Why did you do this?" Fan Xian smiled and said, "Father has always hoped that I could quickly make a name for myself in the capital, and I've thought about it. Writing poetry and writing is really meaningless. If I can fight a lawsuit against the family of a minister, I'm sure I'll make a name for myself a lot faster." This was of course a joke. If you want to fight, then fight. Why do you have to reveal your identity to fight? It's as if you're afraid that it won't be troublesome. There was a trace of anger in Madame Lu's words. Fan Xian respectfully replied, "I just wanted to vent my anger. If I don't let the person being hit know that I was the one who hit him, how can I vent my anger?" Lady Lu glanced at him and felt that the handsome boy in front of her was many times more capable than her son. Although he seemed to be doing some tyrannical things on the surface, looking at his bearing and steadiness, she knew that he naturally knew what he was doing. She couldn't help but sigh and feel a bit disappointed. Fan Xian didn't know what she was thinking. He smiled and asked curiously, "Auntie, why did you help me earlier?" Lady Lu slowly raised her head. There were already some fine wrinkles on the edges of her eyes. She seemed to be surprised that the young man would speak so directly. After thinking for a while, she faintly replied, "Although my surname is Lu, I am a member of the Fan family." Fan Xian stared into her eyes. He knew that this woman's words couldn't be completely trusted, but he didn't know how to respond. It was so quiet in the reception hall that you could hear a pin drop. "Master Mei is my father's student. I've already sent someone to get the letter. Your father should have received the news by now. I'm sure nothing will happen to him. At most, he'll have to pay them a few taels of silver." Lady Lu closed her eyes, seeming a bit tired. "In the afternoon, have the housekeeper accompany you to the capital government. Ting Zijing followed you last night. Don't follow him to the government office today, lest you attract too much attention." Fan Xian looked curiously at Lady Lu's still beautiful cheeks. He couldn't understand why a woman with such a powerful family and such ability would be willing to marry his father as a concubine. By noon, Fan Manor had made all the necessary preparations. Everything that needed to be done had been done, and the paths that needed to be taken had been notified ahead of time. They had also sent servants to find out that Guo Baoquan had already been carried to the court on a stretcher. Only then did Lady Lu arrange for a carriage and a few servants to surround Fan Xian. Like a victorious general, they drove to the magistrate's office. Sitting in the carriage, Fan Xian didn't care much about this trip to the court. He had really beaten Guo Baoquan to vent his anger. The first time he noticed that Guo Baoquan looked at Ruoruo strangely, he had wanted to beat him up. Being insulted by Guo Baoquan at the poetry gathering in King Jing's manor had only made him more determined to beat him up. It was just that he had just entered the capital and caused such a ruckus. Although he had some tricks up his sleeve, he was still afraid that it would be difficult to clean up the mess later. But he still wanted to beat Guo Baoquan. Beating someone up was a means, but the key was to see what kind of effect it would have. Fan Xian wanted to beat Guo Baoquan for 3 reasons. First, he wanted to see what kind of power his father had hidden in the capital's bureaucracy, so that he could make arrangements for the future. His father had always been secretive about these things, and if he asked directly, he wouldn't be able to get a clear answer. At the same time, he could confirm some of the questions that Fan Xian had hidden in the depths of his heart. Second, he wanted to smear some dirty water on himself. No matter what, going to court would solidify Fan Xian's image as a hedonistic, tyrannical and unreasonable son of a rich family. This was exactly what Fan Xian wanted, because he was carefully controlling a certain degree of goodwill from the palace. Although he had accepted his father's request to establish a scholarly side of himself, he had always been prepared to make his reputation known far and wide, so that the palace would take the initiative to cancel the engagement, all for the sake of Chicken Drumstick. The third reason was simple. Guo Baoquan really did need to be beaten up. Arriving outside the yamen, Fan Xian was startled. Looking at the excited crowd outside the red wooden fence, he was very puzzled. With the help of a few servants, he squeezed in with difficulty. Standing on the cool stone floor of the court, he looked at the painting of the red sun rising from the east sea on the wall behind the case, and the sinister sticks of punishment standing all around him. He thought to himself that he had arrived at the Beijing High People's Court, and that his trip had not been in vain. Turning around, he found that the people of the capital were even more excited than he was. They were desperately squeezing forward, wanting to get a better position. A few professional bachelors were almost sitting on the red fence. Fan Xian curiously asked Zheng Ta, who had been sent by Lady Lu to follow him. Many years ago, Mr. Zheng was a famous criminal teacher in the Jiangnan area. It seemed that he had a friendship with the current capital magistrate, so it was most appropriate for Lady Lu to send him. Zheng Ta smiled and explained, "The people of the capital are all brave. Don't be fooled by their appearance. They might be poor relatives of the Duke, so no one is afraid of anyone. Like today, a lawsuit between a minister and an assistant minister is indeed rare. No one would want to miss out on something like this." Fan Xian thought to himself, "Are you guys here to watch a blockbuster?" He shook his head, feeling a headache coming on. Zheng Ta quietly asked, "Young master, although we've already talked about this in the manor, I still want to ask one last time. Did you do this? Of course, I can't admit it in front of the magistrate, but if you tell me the truth I can explain later." Fan Xian's face was full of sincerity. "Mr. Zheng, I don't dare lie to you. I really didn't hit that Master Gua." Zheng Ta looked at the handsome young man's kind and honest face and laughed. He gently patted him on the shoulder to show his appreciation. After a while, the shout that Fan Xian had been curious about finally rang out. The magistrate, Mei Zhili, came out of the back hall with a stretcher and sat down. After a while, a mummy was also pushed out from the back hall in a wheelchair. Behind him was a counselor who was waving a paper fan. Fan Xian looked at the mummy and couldn't help but laugh bitterly. He didn't hit him that hard, he thought. How could a minister's manner play such a pitiful trick? The mummy was, of course, Master Guo Baoquan, who had been beaten up in a daze. His whole body was in pain, especially the bridge of his nose. The doctor's treatment didn't have much effect. He didn't know that Fan Xian had put some hidden strength into his last punch. The Jinqi in Fan Xian's body was different from the Jinqi commonly seen in the world. It was overbearing and fierce, and it wasn't something that could be healed in a short time. Guo Baoquan looked at Fan Xian, who was standing in the hall like nothing had happened. His eyes, which were not covered by the bandages, showed a fierce expression, as if he was about to devour someone. Fan Xian pretended not to see this. He looked at the lawyer waving the fan and asked Zheng Ta in a low voice. Only then did he learn that the lawyer was the famous lawyer in the capital, Song Shuren. He had always been a bad person and only worked for the families of high officials. That was why he was known as Fat Mouth. The magistrate, Mei Zhili, who was sitting high up in the hall, slammed the gavel in his hand. The sound was loud and clear, and the noise inside and outside of the hall quieted down. The spectators who were leaning on the red fences were silent. After all, no one wanted to miss a good show. "Who goes there?" Mei Zhili asked slowly. He had already been informed by both sides and had a rough idea of what to do. However, he still had to act according to the rules. He glanced at the people in the court with an authoritative gaze. "No matter who you are, in the capital government you have to listen to me." Chapter 76. Hearing his words, both the plaintiff and the defendant agreed. Song Shuren handed over the petition again. Mei Zhili pretended to read it, then handed it over to Zheng Tuo for Fan Xian to read. Fan Xian looked at it carefully and found it was not too different from what he had expected. He nodded and handed it back. Song Shuren cupped his hands and said coldly, "I just don't understand. Why is Master Fan Xian standing proudly in the courtroom, not bowing or bowing? With such conduct, it's no wonder he did such a cruel thing last night." Fan Xian looked at the lawyer and asked curiously, "You have to kneel in court?" He had studied in Danzhou every day and was familiar with the laws of the kingdom of Qin. Of course he knew what was going on, and he asked on purpose, "Of course. Do you dare disrespect the majesty of the court?" Song Shuren frowned as he looked at the other party. In fact, he was extremely unwilling to fight today's lawsuit. After all, he was facing the Fan family, a family that did not reveal their true strength, but in reality many people feared the Fan family. But he had no choice. He had already gone too far on the path of being a minister. There was no turning back, so he could not refuse. Fan Xian laughed. "Then why don't you kneel, Mr. Song?" Song Shuren squinted at the young man, wondering if he was really an idiot or if he was pretending to be weak. He said stiffly, "I have scholarly honors. I do not kneel in front of an official. This is the rule of the court." Fan Xian bowed to the prefect, Mei Zhili. "Greetings, teacher. Should I kneel?" Hearing this, Song Shuren knew that he must have scholarly honors. But he had investigated in the minister's manner, and this Fan Xian had clearly not taken the examination. How could he be a scholar? He patted his fan and asked, "Master Fan, may I ask, when did you take the examination?" Fan Xian replied politely, "The year before last in Danzhou." This was something Fan Jian had arranged for before he entered the capital, but he did not know it himself. It was not until today's lawsuit that he realized he had unknowingly acquired the status of a scholar. The matter of kneeling or not was put to rest, and the court case officially began. Both sides went around the main topic a few times, each expressing their own opinions. Wu Baoquan insisted that Fan Xian and a few guards from Fan Manor had injured him the night before, while Zheng Tua insisted that Fan Xian had been in Fan Manor the entire night, with many servants as witnesses. As the fight began, the chatter of the commoners outside the capital city grew louder. There were more people who believed in Fan Xian. They felt that such a beautiful and delicate young master could not possibly be a murderer. And that Master Gua, who was sitting in a wheelchair and had been beaten to such a state, did not look like a good person. Mei Zhili looked down at the argument and was annoyed. He waved his hand to signal the crowd to stop. "Sir, if I may ask, the murderer is standing in the courtroom right now." Song Shuren wanted to gain the upper hand. He thought that the complaint was very clear, but the magistrate had not said anything for a long time. Perhaps he had already decided to side with the Fan Manor, so he quickly pressed forward. Zheng Tu smiled slightly. "Mr. Song, your mouth is a little too fast. Mr. Guo was attacked last night. According to the case report, someone put a sack over his head, and then he suffered such a tragedy. Since his head was covered before he was beaten, how could you see the face of the assailant? How could you determine that it was Mr. Fan who did it?" "Of course I heard Mr. Fan's voice. Mr. Fan admitted it himself. Are you going to deny it now?" Song Shuren looked at Fan Xian mockingly. "As a man, do you have no sense of responsibility?" Fan Xian knew that Zheng Ta was trying to provoke him, but his face was calm. He was a little surprised, as if he did not understand why Zheng Ta was trying to frame him. Zheng Ta's voice rang out again, full of mockery. "Voice. I have studied the laws of the Qing Kingdom, and have never heard of a case being decided by voice." Song Shuren was not in a hurry. He said slowly, "If voice is not enough to prove Mr. Fan's identity, then let me show you a poem." Having said this, he took out a piece of paper from his sleeve and slowly read it out. Mei Zhili, who was sitting behind the table, was lost in thought. Suddenly hearing the poem, he became spirited. Good poem, good poem. Who wrote it?" After saying this, he remembered that he was in the courtroom, not in the study. He was not at a poetry conference but a trial. He coughed and had Song Shuren bring the poem up. He looked at it carefully and felt that the poet's talent aside, just his skill in refining the words was rare in the world. He asked Song Shuren curiously, "Who wrote this poem and how is it related to this case?" Song Shuren asked. Song Shuren respectfully replied, "This poem was written by Mr. Fan Xian at the poetry conference at Prince Jing's manor yesterday. Last night, when Mr. Fan blocked the street and beat up Mr. Gua, he also recited these lines. He also said that he wanted Mr. Gua to do this and that." Mei Zhili was shocked. He looked at the young man in the courtroom, his face full of sincerity and a bright smile. He had never imagined that someone from Fan Manor could write such a poem. Hearing what Song Shuren said after that, he felt a headache coming on. You can beat people up if you want, but you have to recite a poem. How can a place of elegance be in a place like this? Now the other party had a handle on him. Mei Zhili was a man of great experience, but the reason he had been able to sit in the key position of the capital magistrate for so many years was because of his ability to smooth things over. The capital was full of hidden dragons and crouching tigers, and there were many rich and powerful people. If he was only fair and just, he would not be able to stay in office for long. When he first entered the palace, Eunuch Gua had taught him 4 words of wisdom: smooth things over. From then on, Mei Zhili had adhered to these 4 words, and he had lived in peace for many years. So he still maintained this attitude towards today's case. He would not make any decisions, and it would be up to the 2 manors to negotiate privately. If it did not work out, he would drag the case out for a few days and hand it over to the Ministry of Justice. Since he was smoothing things over, he could not let the case become an ironclad one in his own manner. He looked at Fan Xian and Zheng Kuo with some worry. Zheng Kuo had been an advisor in Mei Zhili's yamen for a while, so he knew what his old boss was worried about. He laughed and said, "How ridiculous. At the poetry festival there were so many scholars and so many people. Master Fan's poem was amazing and someone copied it. It's not surprising that others know about it. More importantly." He looked at Song Shuren coldly and sneered, "Has Master Fan lost his mind? He composed this poem in the afternoon, and then he went to beat someone up in the middle of the night, and recited a poem while beating someone up? Not to mention how ridiculous that scene was, it was obvious who he was. Only an idiot would be so stupid. It was obvious that someone had a grudge against Master Gua, and they knew about the disagreement between Master Fan and Master Gua in the restaurant a few days ago. So they deliberately misled Master Gua into thinking that Master Fan was the culprit. The words young master, made sense. But Fan Xian, who was standing to the side with a smile, heard him say that only an idiot would be so stupid. He could not help but cough awkwardly. Guo Baoquan, who was sitting in his wheelchair, could not help but curse. Don't try to argue your way out of this. This illegitimate son, relying on the power of Fan Manor, has no regard for the law. That's why he is so unscrupulous. Hearing the words illegitimate son, Zheng Kuo's face darkened. He felt that his young master had made a wise move by beating the man into a wheelchair. He said coldly, Master Gua, as a palace you should watch your words. Although I know you are angry, you should not let your anger out. After all, you are close to the crown prince. It would not be good if you hurt the reputation of the palace. These words were meant to provoke Guo Baoquan, and also to make it clear that in terms of power, Fan Manor could not compare to the Guo family, who were close to the crown prince. What Guo Baoquan had said before was naturally untenable. As expected, the people outside the gate began to talk. More and more people believed that Fan Xian was innocent. Fan Xian's face was expressionless, but he admired Zheng Kuo very much. Some of the things he had arranged the night before had been used by Zheng Kuo. Nothing had been left out. Strangely, Song Shuren was not as anxious as Guo Baoquan. He smiled and said, Magistrate, my master is injured. Would you like to go and rest? Mei Zhili nodded and had the bailiffs lead the angry Guo Baoquan to the back. At this time, Song Shuren turned around and bowed to Fan Xian and Zheng Kuo. He said, So Master Fan does not want to admit to beating people up. For some reason, after Guo Baoquan left, Song Shuren's expression became a lot more flamboyant, as if the real battle was about to begin. Zheng Kuo and Fan Xian smiled at the same time and said nothing. What a joke. Nilan Street was so dark. Without witnesses and evidence, how could they prove that they were the ones who beat people up? Moreover, it was stated clearly on the papers that the guards and servants of Guo Manor were drugged. Even if they were asked to testify that Fan Xian was the one who beat people up, no one would believe them. Even Mei Zhili frowned. He called Song Shuren to the front and said in a low voice, Let's leave it at that for today. Song Shuren cupped his hands and frowned. Master Gua is a compiler and he was beaten up on the street. This is a big deal. How can we just close the case? Mei Zhili was angry. When did I say I would close the case? I am only postponing the trial. The Guo family only said that they were beaten up. You have to show evidence. Even if Fan Xian wasn't a scholar, the capital's government wouldn't punish him. So it was basically impossible for Fan Xian to ask for help from the Fan Manor. Unexpectedly, Song Shuren turned around and asked, Master Fan, were you in the manor all last night? Zheng Kuo replied, Yes, everyone in the manor can testify. Song Shuren laughed coldly. Bring in the witnesses. Only then did Mei Zhili realize that there were still uncertainties. He nodded and the Guo Mansion's people brought a group of people into the hall. These people were dressed in different attire and had different occupations. There were people selling glutinous rice balls, night watchmen, sedan carriers waiting for business at the street entrance, and even a prostitute. Zheng Kuo frowned slightly, feeling that something was wrong. The onlookers were curious. What is this? Chapter 77. As soon as Song Shuren opened his mouth, everyone knew what was going on. These people were people who made a living on the streets of the capital at night. After Song Shuren's interrogation, these people respectfully confessed that they had seen the Fan family's sedan chair leave King Jing's manor yesterday. Instead of returning to the manor, it had gone to the west of the city. Then, in the middle of the night, it had mysteriously been carried back. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes as he looked at the scene. He somewhat admired the Guo family's ability to find so many people who had seen him in half a day. Seeing that he was not worried, Zheng Kuo was a little worried. He lowered his voice and said, Later, even if you die, you won't admit it. Just say that these people were bought by the Guo family. Fan Xian sighed. Guo Baoquan was indeed beaten and his injuries were so bad. Did they spend so much money just to accuse me? It doesn't make sense. Zheng Kuo did not expect the young master to consider things from the enemy's point of view, and was stunned for a moment. At this moment, Song Shuren's lips curled into a mocking smile. He looked at Fan Xian. Master Fan, were you not at the manor last night? Why did so many people in the capital see you but did not return to the manor? Dare I ask, Master Fan, what were you doing in the middle of the night on the streets of the capital? Why are you acting so sneakily? The capital magistrate, Mei Zhili, frowned at Fan Xian, waiting to see how he would answer. The court was silent. Fan Xian sighed. There was a trace of embarrassment on his face. He smiled awkwardly as if someone had discovered his secret. He quietly replied, "Last night? I spent the night at the Drunken Immortal Tavern." Everyone knew what kind of place the Drunken Immortal Tavern was. Thinking that this young master had spent the night in a brothel, his secretive actions seemed to make sense. The spectating crowd gave a collective "oh" in unison and roared with laughter. Naturally, some of the laughter was mocking Fan Xian. Mei Zhili heard this explanation and let out a sigh of relief. Song Shuren continued to smile. The Drunken Immortal Tavern? May I ask if Master Fan has any witnesses? Si Lily can testify, Fan Xian said awkwardly. Song Shuren paused and suddenly laughed mockingly. Is that so? But Miss Si Lily has already left the capital for Suzhou. This is too much of a coincidence. I don't know if someone is afraid that Miss Si Lily will say something she shouldn't. Fan Xian raised his head and stared at Song Shuren. Only now did he realize that the Guo family had used some unknown method to force Si Lily out of the capital. It seemed that they had been prepared. Seeing that he was speechless, Song Shuren was confident. He bowed to Master Mei and said, "Everything is clear now. Master Fan was the one who beat someone up first and then gave a false confession. I ask that you detain this criminal in prison and await trial." Zheng Tuo, who had been silent for a while, suddenly smiled and said, "How grand are your words? Could it be that just because my young master went out at night, he has to be charged with such a huge crime?" Song Shuren pressed, "Since Master Fan is traveling, may I ask why you said that Master Fan stayed in the manor all night?" Zheng Kui answered naturally, "Sleeping with prostitutes is not a good reputation, so I had no choice but to." Song Shuren interrupted him with a smile, "Sleeping with prostitutes? Where is the flower now? And where is the willow?" He cupped his hands and said in a clear voice, "Master Guo and Master Fan had a quarrel a few days ago, and they were attacked last night. In their arrogance they claimed to be Fan Xian. Master Fan didn't return all night and couldn't say where he went. May I ask who the real culprit is? Isn't it obvious at a glance?" Mei Zhili looked at the lawyer coldly, thinking that no matter how much you talked about this case, did you really think it was a normal criminal case? He couldn't help but look down on this famous talker. He turned his head and asked, "Fan Xian, do you have any evidence to prove where you were last night?" Fan Xian thought for a while and smiled, "Actually, I was fooling around with Crown Prince Jing last night. I don't know if that counts as a witness." Now that Crown Prince Jing was involved, there was no point in trying the case. Mei Zhili's face darkened and he called for both sides to come forward. He said something in a low voice and announced that the case was temporarily closed. Fan Xian was to stay in the capital for investigation, and was not allowed to leave the city. Naturally, the Guo family didn't agree, but the weight of this witness was too great. They had no choice but to go back to the manor and discuss it again. The bystanders of the capital found the case to be so boring. The minister's family and the assistant minister's family didn't make much of a fuss before it ended. They left after a hubbub. When Fan Xian and Zheng Tu all walked out of the magistrate's office, they were surprised to find Song Shuren waiting for them outside. "Master Fan." Song Shuren smiled and bowed. Fan Xian didn't know what he meant, so he returned the bow. Song Shuren said quietly, "I owe the Guo family a favor, so I had no choice but to offend you today." Fan Xian suddenly thought of something and frowned. Did Si Lily really leave the capital? As soon as Song Shuren left the court, he looked at the young master with great respect and said yes. Fan Xian stared into his eyes and asked, "Did you do it or did the Guo family do it?" Song Shuren was a little surprised. "I thought it was Master Fan who sent her out of the capital. Could it be that you were really at the Drunken Immortal Tavern last night?" Fan Xian smiled bitterly. "Do you really think I was the one who beat Guo Baoquan?" At this time the case had come to an end, but the words of both sides were still somewhat untrue. After a few words, Song Shuren turned around and got on a soft carriage, leaving the capital government's yamen. Fan Xian looked in that direction and asked curiously, "You've already offended them, why bother showing goodwill?" Song Shuren is a smart man. Zheng Tu shook his head with a smile and said softly, "Young master didn't say that you were drinking with Crown Prince Jing. Song Shuren almost scared me to death when he did this." Fan Xian smiled and said, "Everyone knows that the court was just a formality. Why are you so nervous?" Zheng Tuo shook his head and sighed. "No matter how this develops, I've offended the Guo family. I'm going to offend someone eventually, so I might as well offend someone I can. Young master, your reputation, as a prostitute, as a poet, will probably spread throughout the capital within a day. That's my wish. I wouldn't dare to ask. Impressive. You're welcome. In the depths of the palace, the yellow glazed tiles glowed gold under the sunlight, and the vermilion walls gave off a sense of oppression. In the garden at the back of the hall, a benevolent-looking old lady was listening to a female official beside her with her eyes half closed. In front of her were two noble women serving her. On the stone table was a mixture of exotic fruits and vegetables. One of the noble women looked dignified, with phoenix eyes and red lips. Her brows were full of care and restraint. She peeled a fruit and carefully fed it to the old lady. "Empress, how come it's you?" The old lady opened her eyes and saw the fruit she handed to her. She smiled and said, "Let the children do these things. You're the ruler of the harem, the mother of the nation. How can you do these things?" The noble woman smiled gently. "Filial piety must be done no matter what." This noble woman was the empress of the kingdom of Qing, and the old woman she served was the emperor's birth mother, the former King Cheng, now the empress dowager. But who was the identity of the woman sitting on the other side, who could sit side by side with the empress? "There's no need to read," the empress dowager said quietly to the female official. "You can all leave." All of the palace maids retreated, leaving only two old nannies. The empress dowager closed her eyes and rested for a while. She asked, "What do you think of the Fan family's poems?" The empress dowager smiled. "I don't know much about words, but it sounds good." The empress dowager laughed. "It's not just good. That one was full of envy, but the last one was 10,000 miles of sorrowful autumn is always a guest. It's not something an ordinary scholar could write, but..." Seeing the empress dowager stop talking, the empress dowager asked, "But what?" The empress dowager sighed. "But there's too much sadness in the sentences. And at such a young age, how could he write something so old? I'm afraid that the child is also a person with little fortune." Hearing this, the other noble woman who had been silent all this time burst into tears. No one knew why she was so sad. The empress dowager hurriedly comforted her. "Empress dowager is just saying that. If Fan Xian really is a person with little fortune, you can just pick out some from your fingernails and give it to him." The empress dowager was also annoyed by her crying. Her face was full of displeasure. "I only have 3 children. The emperor doesn't need to say anything. Although Li Ji is playful, he knows his fate. But you've been crying for decades and you still don't understand. Really?" After all, she was her own daughter, and her daughter had been miserable all her life, so she couldn't say anything harsh. The noblewoman sobbed. "My child is already a person with little fortune, and the emperor wants her to marry the Fan family's child with even less fortune. What will happen to her in the future? What if Chen Er's illness doesn't improve?" It turned out that this extremely weak, crying noblewoman was actually Fan Xian's potential mother-in-law, the unmarried eldest princess. The empress dowager finally couldn't help but scold her. "Chen Er's illness is because you, as a mother, didn't give her any good fortune, and now you have the nerve to say such things. What about the Fan family's child?" As soon as he said he wanted to give Chen Er good fortune, he brought the child back from Danzhou without a second thought. Not to mention that he's a poor child with no status, but just based on Fan Jian's love for the royal family, you shouldn't say anything bad about the Fan family. The serving girls nearby had long since left, leaving only a few old nannies standing with their hands behind their backs, as if they hadn't heard anything. The empress dowager's chest heaved with anger. The empress dowager hurried over to rub it. The empress dowager moved her hand away. Her tone softened a little. "Besides, Chen Er will have to marry eventually. She's the son of a famous official in the court. Whoever marries her won't necessarily have a good life. This Fan, what's his name again?" The empress dowager hurriedly reminded her. "Fan Xian." "Yes, Fan Xian. You heard what he said earlier. He is indeed a talented child. Being a match for Chen Er is not a bad thing." The empress dowager took a couple of breaths. "And the emperor has already approved this marriage. What's the point of making a fuss here?" Chapter 78. The eldest princess was the former emperor's only daughter. After the current emperor ascended the throne, she was given the title of eldest princess Yong Tao. Ever since King Cheng's time in the palace, the eldest princess had been greatly favored. However, her temperament did not follow the path of arrogance and domineering. Instead, she sank deeper and deeper into the sorrowful waters of a green lake. She would often become sentimental, shed tears over flying flowers, and weep over the eastward river. Of course, this was a personality trait that she would only reveal in front of those closest to her. She looked at the empress dowager bitterly and said, "My brother, the emperor, could have chosen anyone else but the Fan family. He knew that the Fan family and the Prime Minister, all of you leave first. The Empress Dowager suddenly opened her eyes and lowered her voice to speak in a dignified manner. The housemaids were expressionless and quietly left the room. Slap. A red handprint appeared on the eldest princess's face. She looked at her mother in front of her, her eyes filled with fear. The Empress Dowager gritted her teeth and said in a cold voice, "How many times have I told you not to mention that person in front of me? You may be shameless, but the royal family is. If you had not protected him with your life, I would have killed that person long ago. All these years I have never let him see Chin'er, but I have never placed any obstacles in his way." The Empress Dowager's kindness had long disappeared. Her face was frosty. "Because I know that when he wanted to marry you, it was because you were afraid of ruining his future, so you did not marry him. Fine. You wanted to give him a future, so I gave him a future. Now that he is the head of the officials, you should have fulfilled your original wish. However, I will not allow you to have anything to do with him. When it comes to Chin'er's marriage, the Lin family cannot have any say in it. Do you understand?" The eldest princess wiped away her tears and tried her best to smile, but her voice was trembling. "I understand." The Empress Dowager then turned around and looked at the Empress. "The Emperor is busy with government affairs. You should worry about this kind of thing. You should take care of your own children's marriages. However, since the Emperor has promised Chin'er to the Fan family, you should not interfere." "Yes." The Empress had long been shocked by the scene just now, so she quickly lowered her head and answered. "Empress, don't always wait by Aijia's side. When you have free time, spend more time with His Majesty and help His Majesty." The Empress Dowager's tone was much warmer and the encouragement in her words was very clear. The Empress smiled bitterly and agreed. Suddenly, she frowned as if she had thought of something. How could the Empress Dowager not know what these people were thinking? She said softly, "If you have something to say, say it." The Empress glanced at the eldest princess, who was still wiping away her tears. In a low voice she said, "Eunuch Hong sent someone earlier to say that the Jingdo Yamen is trying a case today. What case is it that even that old dog is interested in it?" The Empress Dowager smiled embarrassedly. "Mother, actually, everyone in the capital is interested in this matter. Because this case started in the Yamen this morning, it dragged on until just now. I heard that Guo Baoquan, the only son of the Minister of Rights, Guo Yu, filed a lawsuit against the Fan family. He said that the Fan family blocked Guo Baoquan in the street last night and beat him up. The Fan family even recited a poem. This poem. Mother, you saw it earlier." "Oh." The Empress Dowager was very surprised. 10,000 miles of sorrowful autumn came to visit and beat someone up? Hearing this, the Empress Dowager couldn't help but cover her mouth and laugh. Even the eldest princess stopped crying and smiled. She said, "Mother, you are very funny." The Empress Dowager laughed. "It's not that I'm funny, it's that Fan Xian. He's only been in the capital for a few days, and yet he already beat up the minister's son. Quick, tell me, what is it like in the Jingdo Yamen?" She suddenly thought of something and frowned. The capital government doesn't dare to use torture, right? If he's beaten up, how can he get married in October? The Empress Dowager laughed. "Mother, what are you saying? Although Fan Xian doesn't have a proper background, he is still Count Sinan's son. He is talented and has long been a scholar. There is no way he would be beaten up." "That's good." The Empress Dowager said, "Is Guo Baoquan one of those people who is always with the crown prince?" For some reason, the Empress Dowager's face suddenly became a little uneasy, and she quietly agreed. As expected, the Empress Dowager snorted. "Those little rascals only know how to play tricks. They're all full of evil tricks. Needless to say, that Fan Xian must have done a good job." The eldest princess's expression didn't change, but her feelings were complicated. She never expected that her mother would not ask for the reason, and would just say that the illegitimate son of the Fan family had done a good job. But she had just been slapped and scolded, and now was not a good time to speak up. Fortunately, the Empress Dowager said, "That Guo Baoquan has some talent. Being beaten up in the street like this is somewhat unjustifiable." The Empress Dowager seemed to sense that the Empress Dowager didn't think much of it. She simply asked, "What's the outcome of the case?" Fan Xian brought out Crown Prince Jing as a witness, so the capital government couldn't do anything about it. They could only postpone the trial for now. Hongqing was his witness? It looks like this Fan Xian has some connections. The Empress Dowager was secretly delighted. She knew that although the Empress Dowager didn't seem to care much, she actually hated the close relationship between the officials and the royal family. But she also knew that she had to act appropriately, and that she couldn't say too much. So she changed the topic. I heard that on the night that Guobaoquan was beaten, Fan Xian and Crown Prince Jing were on the Lujing River, staying there. So this matter has nothing to do with him. The palace garden was silent for a while, and the atmosphere was somewhat oppressive. The Empress Dowager suddenly stood up and said, "I'm a little tired." Outside, the palace maids and palace maids hurried over to help her up, and a large group of people walked back to the palace. Seeing the Empress Dowager's carriage slowly turn around the palace walls, the Empress Dowager and the eldest princess stood up and looked at each other. The Empress Dowager's lips curled into a wry smile. It looks like even though the Empress Dowager is unhappy with Fan Xian's visit to the brothel, she hasn't changed her mind. I'm afraid that in half a year Qian'er will really have to get married. The eldest princess sighed. I'm just worried about Fan Xian's character, but... She looked at the Empress, and her expression was as delicate as a weeping willow by the river. The Fan family has a good relationship with King Jing. You should be careful, Your Highness. The Empress Dowager's heart trembled. She knew that the eldest princess was reminding her that if Fan Xian really did marry Fan Xian's daughter, and His Majesty really did hand over the palace treasury business to the Fan family, then the Fan father and son, one in the Ministry of Revenue and the other in the palace treasury, would have control over most of the Qing kingdom's money. And if the Fan family, because of their relationship with King Jing, were to fall in line with the second prince, then the crown prince. She frowned. Although her son wasn't much of a talent, he was still His Majesty's only legitimate son. Did His Majesty have a deeper meaning for this? Don't think too much about it. The eldest princess comforted her. You know that I haven't had much to do with the palace treasury these past 2 years. The Overwatch Council has always had people watching over it. After all, the Fan family's status isn't high enough. Even if Fan Xian really did marry Qian'er, he wouldn't be able to truly control the palace treasury. The Empress Dowager frowned. Right now, I'm just wondering what that old man Fan Jian did to the Emperor to convince His Majesty. The eldest princess smiled. You haven't summoned Lady Lu to the palace in a long time, have you? The Empress Dowager's expression turned cold. That woman married Fan Jian as a concubine. It seems stupid, but she's actually very cunning. 4 years ago you suggested killing the illegitimate son in Danzhou, but Lady Lu took the lead. She must hold a grudge against us. I'm afraid it won't be easy to lure her out and use her as a shield. So what? The eldest princess smiled sweetly. Even though she was in her 30s, her skin was still very well maintained. Would she dare to say anything? Besides, I've known Lady Lu since I was young. I know she's someone who likes to get into a dead end. The Empress Dowager suddenly frowned. Come to think of it, it's strange. Why did His Majesty decide 4 years ago to let the Fan family manage the palace treasury? If it weren't for the urgency of the matter, he wouldn't have had to take such a risk. The eldest princess spoke softly. My brother the Emperor doesn't like my relationship with you being too good, so he decided to let me leave the palace treasury. Otherwise, he wouldn't have had the director send someone to guard me from the beginning. She then sighed. The court is full of civil and military officials. Whether they're good or bad, there's always a way to control them. But Director Qin is so loyal to His Majesty that he manages the affairs of the council so well that not even a drop of water can leak out. There's no way for us to send someone in. Hearing this, the Empress Dowager frowned imperceptibly. As an official, loyalty to His Majesty is a matter of course. We secretly sent someone in because we were worried that the Emperor would be deceived by a treacherous official. Director Chen's loyalty can be seen by the heavens. There's nothing more to say. The eldest princess knew she had said the wrong thing. She spoke softly. Yes. But these years, the Overwatch Council has never stopped investigating the assassination in Danzhou. It seems that His Majesty has given strict orders. Of course. When His Majesty saw your daughter after drinking, he was very happy. He took her in as his adopted daughter and assigned her to the Fan family. Only a few people in the palace know about this. The Empress Dowager recalled the scene from 4 years ago. She spoke coldly. In the end, within a month, there was an assassin in Danzhou. Although this matter wasn't brought to light, the Overwatch Council knew all about it. How could His Majesty not know? Naturally, he didn't care about the life or death of his illegitimate child. What he cared about was that someone in the palace dared to leak his words. Chapter 79. There was a flash of fear in the eldest princess's eyes. It's been 4 years and the Overwatch Council still hasn't relaxed. I'm afraid that one day they'll find out. I heard that Qin Pingping went home to visit his family and refused to return to the capital. If he's really willing to retire, then that would be great. Not necessarily. The Empress laughed coldly. Don't forget that 4 years ago, it was Qin Pingping who entered the palace and talked to the Emperor for an entire night. Only then did the Emperor withdraw his decree. A few days ago, Qin Pingping returned home to visit his family, and Fan Jian took the opportunity to enter the palace. Only then did the Emperor appoint Qin Er to Fan Xian, and made it clear that from now on you don't need to worry about the palace treasury. If Qin Pingping were in the capital now, I'm afraid that this marriage would still be changing. Perhaps it would really go according to your wishes. Or rather, according to the Prime Minister's wishes. The eldest princess covered her mouth and laughed. Empress, if this marriage doesn't go through, you should be happy. After all, the second prince will have one less way to make money. The Empress smiled. What do I have to be happy about? In the end, this is just a marriage between the two children. Whether it succeeds or not, it has little to do with me. Mother has also said that I can worry about the children's marriages in the future, but I won't worry about the Fan family's matters. The eldest princess's expression changed slightly, but she still smiled. What you say makes sense. Then, as a mother, there's even less reason for me to worry. Although Fan Xian's background isn't exactly glorious, it seems that he has some talent these days. Besides, Qin Er's spirit seems to have improved a little these days. Perhaps it's because of the approaching wedding. The two most powerful women in the kingdom of Qing sat quietly across from each other, drinking tea and chatting as if nothing had happened. Neither of them wanted to lower their guard, and neither wanted to do that, kill Fan Xian. The marriage would naturally fall through, and the Fan family would be weak. The second prince would no longer have the support of the Prime Minister, and the eldest princess would still be in charge of the palace treasury, providing an endless supply of money to those who needed it. If one of them died, it would seem that the power struggle in the palace would be resolved. But no one was willing to make a move. After all, this wasn't 4 years ago. After all, the capital was not Danzhou. There were countless eyes here, and even the people in the palace couldn't assassinate the son of an official, especially at such a sensitive time. Besides, Lady Lu would never step into the same trap twice in her life. In the Empress Dowager's bedchamber, the seemingly elderly and virtuous woman let down her grizzled hair. Feeling the steady hands behind her combing her hair, she said in a low voice, "Why did I have such a stupid daughter?" The person behind her smiled. "But you still love the eldest princess the most. Otherwise, you wouldn't have allowed the emperor to make such arrangements, and you wouldn't have helped the prime minister do so many things in secret." The Empress Dowager sighed. "This Lin Ruofu, I really don't know if he betrayed me or if it was my son who harmed him." "All right, you old dog, you have sharp eyes. Tell me, why did the emperor allow that boy from the Fan family to marry Qin?" There was some hesitation in the man's voice. "The princess is of marriageable age, and I'm afraid that it's difficult for her to recover. Betrothal to the Fan family is appropriate, but the marriage is only the surface. The key lies in the emperor's ambiguous verbal edict. Such a large estate, and to let an outsider manage it, perhaps. Perhaps the emperor feels that the empress and the eldest princess are too close, and is truly dissatisfied with the crown prince, so he stripped the eldest princess of her power, and prepared to let the second." He suddenly realized that, although he had served the Empress Dowager for decades, he had already expressed too many opinions on this matter, so he stopped talking. The Empress Dowager was startled, and the wrinkles on her face, like the petals of a chrysanthemum flower, gradually spread out. "His Majesty is in charge of state affairs, and I am in charge of family affairs. Then I will not interfere in this matter." "Empress Dowager is wise," the man said flatteringly. "You handled this matter very unwisely." Count Sinan looked coldly at his son in his study. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He had known during the day that he wouldn't be able to escape this round of questioning, so he didn't explain himself. He just admitted his mistake. "You're not a fool, and Guo Baoquan doesn't have any powerful people around him. If you really wanted to beat him up to vent your anger, why did you give yourself away so much?" Without waiting for Fan Xian to explain, Count Sinan continued coldly, "Don't say anything. Beating someone up without reporting it is the same as spouting nonsense." Fan Xian knew that Lady Lu was telling his father about what he had said during the day, and smiled with some embarrassment. Seeing the smile on his face, Fan Xian couldn't get angry. He sighed. "Tell me, why did you make such a fuss?" Fan Xian thought for a moment, then replied, "First of all, I drank with Crown Prince Jing last night and felt that he was a good friend. I used the fight to tie him to me. In the future, with Crown Prince Jing as my backer, it will be easier for me to do whatever I want." Having said this, he stole a glance at his father's eyes. Seeing nothing out of the ordinary, he continued. Second of all, Guo Baoquan is too much of a bully. I had to let him know that I wasn't to be messed with. Fan Xian laughed coldly. This second reason makes sense, but I think the most important reason is that you are against the marriage, so you want to ruin your reputation so that the palace can kick you out. Fan Xian hadn't expected that he wouldn't be able to hide it from his father. He was slightly taken aback and thought about how to explain it. Fan Xian continued coldly, and I said earlier that you weren't smart because you dragged King Jing into this mess. You should know that the Guo family is on the side of the Crown Prince, while Crown Prince Jing is on the side of the second prince. You beat Guo Baoquan and dragged Crown Prince Jing into this mess. In the eyes of others, wouldn't it be as if the Fan family had pledged allegiance to the second prince? Fan Xian pretended to be surprised. Everyone in the kingdom of Qing knows that my father and Crown Prince Jing are on good terms. My sister and Princess Rojia have been friends since childhood. The relationship between the two families is so close that it could be said that, you? Don't forget, your grandmother was His Majesty's wet nurse. She was the one who raised Crown Prince Jing. At the time, His Majesty was busy with other matters, so I was the one who brought him up. Naturally, the relationship between the two families was excellent. Fan Xian snorted. But personal relationships are personal relationships, official affairs are official affairs, and national affairs are national affairs. How can we, the officials, discuss the affairs of the palace? The Crown Prince is still the Crown Prince, the heir to the throne. After His Majesty passes away, the Fan family will of course be loyal to the Crown Prince. Fan Xian could hear the malice in his words. He laughed. If the Crown Prince isn't the Crown Prince, then what? Strangely, Count Sinan was not the slightest bit surprised to hear his son utter such treasonous words, nor did he lecture him. He simply said, only His Majesty can make this decision. Anyone who chooses a side before His Majesty has made a decision is wrong. I understand. Fan Xian finally got what he wanted after beating Guo Baoquan up. The Fan family doesn't side with the Crown Prince, nor does it side with the second prince. It only stands with His Majesty. Correct. Fan Xian's voice was cold. If you don't want to stand on the wrong side, then don't be in such a hurry to pick a side. And as long as you always stand on the side of the strongest, you will never make a mistake. And in this world, the strongest is His Majesty. What if His Majesty dies? Fan Xian looked at his father maliciously. He knew that his father was truly loyal to the emperor. His Majesty is in the prime of his life, and he's younger than I am. Fan Xian smiled. The future is the future. It's a matter for your generation. Do you know how many times we've clashed with the Guo family in court so that you could walk out of court so easily? The Supreme Court, the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Appointments, you can see the shadows of our two families everywhere. In the end, the Guo family even went to the Overwatch Council. If it weren't for Qin Pingping's absence, perhaps you wouldn't have come back today. Qin Pingping? Fan Xian frowned. The name was very familiar. Of course, he knew that the man was the leader of the dark forces in the kingdom of Qing. But he knew the close relationship between the Fan family and the Overwatch Council, so he was a little puzzled. Why can't I come back when Qin Pingping is there? Because he objects to you marrying the eldest princess's daughter. Fan Xian said coldly, this urgent summons to the capital is because Qin Pingping has returned home to visit his family and cannot speak in front of His Majesty. That's why you've been summoned to the capital to confirm the marriage. It's not entirely because of the girl's illness. Fan Xian looked at his father. Fei Jie is my teacher, and you've always had a close relationship with Director Qin. Why would he object? No. To outsiders, I don't have much of a relationship with the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian said lightly. As for why he objects, it's simple. It's because he and I have different views on certain matters, so it leads to completely different judgments. What views? Fan Xian stared into his father's eyes, unwavering. Fan Xian frowned. In the end, he decided to tell the child part of the truth. His Majesty doesn't like the Crown Prince, but the Empress is close to the eldest princess, and the eldest princess controls the flow of money into the palace treasury. This is a secret account, and it's easy to withdraw money from it. This fact worries His Majesty. Fan Xian was shocked. So, His Majesty is afraid that there will be changes in the Eastern Palace? Chapter 80. In the study of Count Sinan's manner, there was no hint of a palace conspiracy about to unfold. Fan Jian laughed. Although the child in front of him was clever, he had too little experience in political struggles. It seemed that he would have to slowly teach him. His Majesty has lived his entire life on horseback. How could he be afraid of such things? It's just that he doesn't want to see his father and son turn against each other, so he used this matter as a warning to the Empress. The Empress? From what he could see, it would be the Empress, the Crown Prince, the eldest princess, or perhaps the Prime Minister. Fan Xian continued to ask. His Majesty should have a better way to resolve this matter. You said before that the Overwatch Council has always supervised the palace treasury. Why did he choose me? It's simple. Fan Jian looked at him, but his eyes seemed to be looking far away as if he was looking at someone else. Because I suggested he choose you. Fan Xian raised his eyebrows. He knew that his father would not explain further, so he changed the subject. Then why did Chen Pingping object? Because he suggested that His Majesty not choose you, Fan Jian said. Chen Pingping has always believed that you should walk a different path. Even the head of the Overwatch Council cared so much about him. Fan Xian suddenly thought of the stone tablet in front of the council. He could not help but ask, why, the Overwatch Council? Why is your mother's name on it? It's simple. The kingdom of Qing did not have an Overwatch Council. Your mother said that there was an Overwatch Council. Fan Jian laughed as if he was very happy. So, the kingdom of Qing had an Overwatch Council. Fan Xian's heart was beating faster than a kangaroo's. His mouth was wide open and he did not recover for a long time. He thought of a familiar phrase from his previous life. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. The conversation between father and son continued. It was only today that Fan Xian learned for the first time what kind of terrifying power the Yi family had. When the Qing kingdom's expeditions to the east and the west had sunk into a financial crisis, it was the Yi family who single-handedly held up the crumbling state government. Currently, the Overwatch Council, which the emperor used to unite the power of the entire Qing kingdom, had actually been established at the suggestion of his mother. From the establishment of the council to the enormous expenses, it had all been single-handedly handled and provided by his mother. No wonder Yi Qingmei's name was written on the door of the Overwatch Council. No wonder he had grown up under the watchful eyes of the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian looked at his father for a long time, then shook his head and sighed. Father, I have something to say. Please don't be angry. Don't worry. When have I ever lost my temper at you? Fan Jian seemed to have guessed what he was going to say. There was a strange smile on his face. Fan Xian thought about his wording for a moment. In the end, he didn't know how to organize his words. He forced a smile and straightforwardly said, "Now, I truly wonder how my mother saw you back then." "Ah, don't forget your mother's name." Count Sinan seemed to have not laughed so happily in many years. He waved his hand and dismissed Fan Jian from the study. Fan Xian walked into the garden and thought, what does this mean? He suddenly understood. Yi Qingmei, looked down on all the men in the world. Father didn't blame you, did he? Fan Ruoruo looked at her brother worriedly. She and Fan Xian did not look like each other. The only similarity they shared was their long eyelashes and fair skin. Fan Xian forced a smile. Blame is not the most frightening part of education. The most frightening part is the long exchange of ideas. Parents always think that they should have an exchange of ideas with their children, but they don't know that this is the most unbearable thing, to be forced to be close to the stale shroud of youth. He was thinking about what he had just seen. As he passed through the reception hall, he saw Fan Xizha impatiently listening to Lady Lu's lecture. Lady Lu only stopped when she saw him. Fan Xian had shamelessly brought Fan Xizha to him. Fan Ruoruo sighed. There's nothing I can do about it. She suddenly remembered the case that had caused such a ruckus in the capital that day. She asked curiously, "Brother, you once said that if you do something you don't want to do, you must have a very clear and strong reason behind it. Today you went to court in the capital. There must be a reason." Fan Xian nodded. Fan Ruoruo didn't ask what the reason was. She only asked, "Did you get the result you wanted?" Fan Xian smiled. "I'm satisfied. At least I know where father stands in the court. I know that the Fan family's influence in the court is much greater than I thought. As for the reason, you can guess, I don't know. After all, I can't become a mosquito and eavesdrop on the conversations of the important people in the palace." Fan Ruoruo rebuked him. "If it's for something like that, there's no need to take such a risk." Fan Xian smiled and explained, "In any case, I've made up my mind to beat up that Guobrat. It's good to see how deep the water in the capital is." I don't understand." Fan Xizha, who had been listening for a long time, finally couldn't help but shout. Fan Ruoruo smiled and took out a ruler. Fan Xizha shouted, You don't understand and you still want to beat me? Fan Ruoro's smile was oppressive. How many times have I told you to call me brother? I know I'm wrong, brother. Fan Xizha was young, but his unscrupulous business mindset made it impossible for him to take a loss. Fan Xian looked at him, amused. I saw your revised plan today and I think you have some talent. How can you not understand what your sister and I are talking about? Fan Xizha shouted angrily, what shroud? Educational session? Who knew you had so many weird words? But I understand that last sentence. He said angrily, hey, you're wrong, brother. That bastard bullied me in the restaurant last time. You should have beaten him up. Why did you wait until last night to beat him up? I don't care. Next time there's something fun and exciting like this, you have to take me with you. Fan Xian looked at him with a wry smile. He thought to himself, don't always try to act like a street bully. When the brother and sister spoke, they didn't avoid Fan Xizha's eyes. This was Fan Xian's decision. On one hand, it was to let Lady Lu know exactly what he was thinking so that in the future, they wouldn't get into a fight because of the poor flow of information. It was like the military exchanges between China and the United States in his previous life. Which side would send an observer? Naturally, Fan Xizha was the observer. On the other hand, he wanted his naughty brother to gradually adapt to the atmosphere of the Fan family's three treasures. Fan Xian believed that it would subtly influence them to develop certain habits, which would make some people think more positively before making certain decisions. After Fan Xizha went to bed, Fan Xian turned his head and asked his sister, have you made the appointment? Fan Ruoro nodded and smiled sweetly. What if someone recognizes us? If the people in the capital knew that you were in such a hurry to see your new wife, I'm afraid they'd all die of laughter, and it might make a lot of people unhappy. Whatever. Fan Xian waved his hand, a little annoyed. I have to confirm this first. Early in the morning, the carriage of the Yi family of the capital's garrison stopped in front of Count Sinan's manor. Yi Linger was waiting anxiously in the carriage. After a while, Fan Ruoro led a sallow-faced, slightly hunched young man out of the manor. Yi Linger's eyes lit up and she went to greet them. Yi Linger curtsied. Thank you, Miss Fan. She then turned to the hunchbacked young man and smiled. Sir, are you Sir Fei's student? The young man smiled. His sallow-colored skin matched with the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. He didn't seem to be in good spirits. He cupped his hands in salute. That's right. Thank you, sir, said Yi Linger. The young doctor smiled and replied politely, the patient is important. Let's hurry. Yi Linger and Fan Ruoro got into the first carriage, and the young doctor got into the second. As he sat in the seat, he found that the carriage was extremely spacious, very different from the ones commonly seen in the capital. There were no unnecessary decorations inside. It seemed that the Yi family had come from the battlefield after all, and always had a solemn air. The young doctor was, of course, Fan Xian. Early that morning, with the help of Ruoro's eyebrow pencil and foundation, he had put on some makeup. This was something he had learned from Fei Jia when he was young, but it seemed that the effect was good. In fact, the main reason for his confidence was because he believed that he had already made a name for himself in the capital, but few people had actually seen him. At least Yi Linger and Miss Lin had never seen him. When he thought of Miss Lin, who he was about to see, Fan Xian's heart suddenly raced. No matter what he planned to do in the future, she was, after all, his fiancée in name, and the white-clothed girl he had always been thinking about was obviously from a rich family. If he wanted a wife and a concubine, there was basically no way. It seemed that he would have to make some kind of choice. As the carriage moved forward, Fan Xian became more and more nervous. Because the direction the carriage was heading in was the royal courtyard, where Miss Lin, his fiancée, currently lived. Pretending to be a doctor today was in itself an extremely absurd thing to do. But when he thought of the chicken leg and the Yi family, and how a so-called wife was someone you would have to spend the rest of your life with on a pillow, Fan Xian couldn't help but be cautious and bold. Just as he had thought before coming to the capital, no matter what, he had to take a look first. Wasn't she cute? Wasn't she pretty? Wasn't she a loli? Chapter 81. In the carriage in front, Yi Linger and Fan Ruoro were talking. Sorry to trouble you. Yi Linger looked hesitant. But is that really Master Fei's student? He looks very young. Fan Ruoro laughed. I know. It's always good to be old, but I'm only letting him have a look. After all, even the imperial physicians admire Master Fei's medical skills. My family has some connections with Master Fei, so there's no harm in letting him have a look. Yi Linger thought about it and agreed. No doctor had ever been able to find a cure for Sister Lin's tuberculosis. The palace had sent for Fei Jie, but he had gone on patrol and wouldn't be back for a while. To be able to find Fei Jie's student today was good luck. She thought about it and finally couldn't help but ask, "Ruoro, I heard that your brother was sued yesterday?" Fan Ruoro wondered why she was asking about this now. She laughed and replied, "Did you add another crime to my brother's list?" Yiling snorted coldly. "I owe you a favor this time, but I don't have a good opinion of your brother. He's a real man, but he's like a dough. Whatever other people tell him to do, he doesn't know how to have his own opinion." Fan Ruoro was delighted. She thought that if her brother really had his own opinion, this marriage would naturally not go through. At that time, who knew who would be unhappy? But she wouldn't say anything. She smiled and replied, "People of our status should know long ago that many things are beyond our control. But isn't your brother too reckless? He's clearly going to marry Sister Lin, and yet he still goes and sleeps with prostitutes. How can Sister Lin put her face like that?" Yi Linger thought about the recent rumors and her heart filled with anger. "Not only that," she said hatefully, "but he hits people in the street. Don't be angry, Ruoro. Tell me, would you be willing to marry someone like that?" Fan Ruoro sighed. What was there to be unwilling about? She changed the subject. "Rumors stop at the mouth of the wise," she said. "Why do you care about what outsiders say? My elder brother is not an unreasonable and dissolute person." Yi Linger laughed coldly. "Isn't that the case? Do you know how the people in the capital have been calling your brother since yesterday? How should I address you?" Fan Ruoro opened her eyes wide and asked curiously. She really did want to know what the people of the capital thought of her different brother. "They say he's the underground fighter from Fan Manor," Yi Linger said angrily. "Look at what people think of your brother." Fan Ruoro covered her mouth and laughed. "Do you know that my brother has another nickname?" "What?" "The Empress Dowager once said, 'The 10,000ly sorrowful autumn is always a guest.' Is hitting people again?" Fan Ruoro suppressed a smile. 10,000ly sorrowful autumn is always a guest? Isn't this nickname a bit too long?" Yi Linger knew that he was trying to tell her that Fan Xian was not only an underground fighter, but also a good poet. She snorted. It was impossible for her to refute the Empress Dowager's opinion. It was clear that the Empress Dowager admired Fan Xian's poem. The two carriages drove into a quiet courtyard not far from the imperial palace. Outside the courtyard, one could clearly see many palace guards. At their waists were simple but easy-to-draw short knives. After getting off the carriage, Yi Linger was about to walk in, but she was stopped by a guard at the gate. "What is it?" Yi Linger asked curiously. "Miss Yi," the guard said awkwardly, "it's fine for you to go in." Yi Linger was so angry that she laughed. She took Fan Ruoro's hand. "This is the daughter of Count Sinan, a famous and talented woman in the capital." She glared at Fan Ruoro. 10,000ly sorrowful autumn is always a guest? Can't I go in?" "Whose 10,000ly sorrowful autumn is always a guest?" The guard, who could read as many characters as a bowl, was dumbfounded. The 10,000ly sorrowful autumn is always a guest was hiding behind Yi Linger, smiling bitterly. Yi Linger giggled. She felt much better. "I invited a doctor to take a look at my sister today. Are you going to stop me?" The guard turned his head and saw the doctor, who had an unsightly expression on his face and a stooped body. He thought to himself, "My goodness, I'm in such a bad shape and you still dare to treat the princess?" But he couldn't say it out loud. After all, he had to give Miss Yi face. How many guards in the palace did not have some sort of relationship with the Yi family? He smiled bitterly and said, "Miss Yi, if you had told the officials earlier, I definitely wouldn't have dared to stop you, nor would I have stopped this doctor. But I really can't today. You see, the doctor you invited isn't registered in the palace. If you go and treat him now, what if something bad happens?" Fan Xian lowered his head, feeling a little anxious. He had worked so hard to come here, and in the end he wouldn't even be able to see Miss Lin's face. Would he have to withdraw? He didn't know that this was the fruit of his own sowing, the cause of today's events. The last time he had muddle-headedly barged into the temple of Qing and exchanged blows with Gong Dian, all the guards in the palace had been scolded by Eunuch Hong and the commander. That was why they were so strict. "What nonsense are you talking about? This gentleman is a student of Sir Fei of the Overwatch Council." Yi Linger glared at the guard. As soon as the guard heard the words Sir Fei, he looked at Fan Xian with respect and quietly took half a step back. He thought of something and frowned. "Sir Fei's student? I don't think I've ever heard of him." Yi Linger had thought of this as well. With Sir Fei's medical skills, his student should be famous. How come she had never heard of him? She turned around suspiciously and looked at Fan Xian. Fan Xian had been prepared for this. He shook his head with a gloomy expression and pulled out a token from his bosom. The token belonged to the Overwatch Council and no one could counterfeit it. Perhaps it could be said that no skilled craftsman in the world would dare to counterfeit it. It had been given to Fan Xian by Fei Jia when he was 6, before he left Danzhou. The guard took the token and looked at it. Without any difficulty, he was certain of the young man's identity. He then looked at the gloomy and sallow face of the young man, and understood that he was indeed Sir Fei's student. It would be difficult not to look like this, having been exposed to poison all year round. Now that they had found a guarantor who could bear the responsibility, the guard let them pass. The three of them walked into the quiet courtyard, passing bushes of flowers along the way. A small gravel path stretched out from the bushes, leading to a small building deep in the courtyard. A servant girl invited the three of them upstairs and then brought them tea. Fan Xian paid close attention to the servant girl's movements, and found that her every movement was measured. It was clear that she had received years of training in the palace. After a while, an old nanny walked out and said with a slightly arrogant expression, "Miss Yi, you're here." Yi Linger clearly didn't like the old woman. She snorted in response. "Where is my sister?" she asked. "The young lady is sleeping." "What brings you here today, Miss Yi?" The old woman seemed to be standing respectfully, but her tone was unapproachable. Fan Xian couldn't help but be surprised. What was going on? Yi Linger didn't want to bicker with the old woman that day. "I found a good doctor for Sister Lin. Go and tell her that when she's ready, the doctor will come to see her." The old woman looked at Fan Xian. She knew that this was the doctor. "You know who the young lady is?" she said coldly. "Aside from the palace doctors, who else is qualified to treat her?" Yi Linger brought up Fan Xian's identity again, but the old woman refused to budge. She was even more difficult to deal with than the guards outside. Fan Xian didn't know the rules of the royal family. Every unmarried daughter was always surrounded by a host of old women. Although there were no restrictions and they weren't like the frightening old spinsters of the Qing dynasty in his previous life, these women were always loyal and foolish, and would never let their masters get close to any danger. Fan Xian was getting impatient and gave Fan Ruoruo a look. Fan Ruoruo understood. She stood up with a smile and said to Yi Linger, "Since this is against the rules, let's go. After all, this place isn't like anywhere else in the capital." As expected, Yi Linger couldn't stand being provoked. She jumped up and scolded the old woman. Fan Xian frowned, thinking that this young lady was too hot-tempered. He didn't know who would teach her a lesson. At that moment, Fan Ruoruo pretended to persuade the aggrieved old woman to sit down at the table, and handed her a cup of tea. After a while, the old woman's expression suddenly changed and she hurried away. At that moment, Miss Lin's servant girl heard the noise and came out of the inner room. Seeing that the old woman wasn't there, she welcomed the three of them inside. Although Yi Linger had a bad temper, she wasn't stupid. She looked at Fan Xian suspiciously. Fan Xian lowered his head and said nothing. He followed her in. He always carried things on his person that no one else could think of: laxatives, sleeping potions, and aphrodisiacs. He never left his hands. He also had a dagger, a hidden crossbow, and wuzhu. With these things by his side, he could go anywhere in the world. Entering Miss Lin's boudoir, Fan Xian lowered his head, not daring to make any strange movements. Only when he smelled a delicate fragrance did he realize that the room was lit with a special incense unique to the highlands. This kind of incense helped the sick rest and recuperate, but the fragrance was so strong that it washed away much of the fragrance that should have been present in a lady's boudoir. Yi Linger went behind the curtain and said something, and then Fan Ruoruo went in. Fan Xian used his jinshi to hear clearly that his sister was greeting the young lady. The young lady only coughed a few times as if she was out of breath. Fan Xian pictured the scene in his mind, wondering what kind of expression his sister-in-law would have when he saw his bride for the first time. Thinking of this, Fan Xian realized that he really was a bit flirtatious. He was clearly in love with the white-clothed girl who was chewing on a drumstick, but now that he had entered Miss Lin's boudoir and smelled the fragrance, he began to imagine what Miss Lin's face would look like when she blushed. "Sir, please come in." Yi Linger invited him on behalf of her master. Fan Xian straightened his body, lifted the curtain, and entered. Chapter 82. This was the first time Fan Xian had stepped into his fiancée's boudoir, but as a doctor. The first thing he saw was the bed decorated with green conch shells and hooked with purple glass. Then there were the three girls, Yi Linger, his sister, and the last girl who had her head down busily pulling up the cloth on the bed. It was the servant girl. Fan Xian coughed twice and walked forward. He sat down on the round stool the servant girl had brought over, and stroked his beard like a real doctor. But the newly glued beard was a bit shaky and it almost fell off. He quickly removed his pose and asked, "Miss, please stretch out your hand." Miss Lin was lying on the bed, and her curly figure could be vaguely seen through the curtains. She listened to the doctor and slowly stretched out her left hand, resting it on a soft wrist pillow. This wrist pillow seemed to be a regular item, and was placed to one side. It seemed that the palace physicians often came to see her. Fan Xian looked at the wrist, which was as white as jade, and his heart skipped a beat. He didn't know why, but he suddenly thought that if he could marry the owner of this wrist, he could touch it again and again in the future. It would be a pleasure. He quickly gathered his thoughts and stretched out a finger, placing it on the wrist. The tip of his finger touched Miss Lin's wrist, and for some reason both of them trembled at the same time. Yi Linger did not dare to disturb the doctor, and looked curiously at this student of Sir Fei's. She found that he had only used one finger, and she thought of the rumors about Sir Fei's methods and grew more confident. She had no idea that although Fan Xian was quite knowledgeable in medicine, he had only studied it for a year, and could not compare to a real royal physician in terms of knowledge. His only advantage was his knowledge of medicine and his experience from his previous life. He had purposely used one finger to break the pulse to frighten the people around him, and establish his image as a divine doctor. Fan Xian's finger felt smooth and clean, and he couldn't help but feel a bit strange. He seemed reluctant to let go. He muttered to himself for a moment. Miss Lin's pulse is a bit weak, but it is full of dryness. It is weak and hot and as thin as gossamer. It is a bit troublesome. What is it? Can I take a look at Miss Lin's face to make a better judgment? No. The servant girl rejected the suggestion without hesitation. Although the kingdom of Qing was relatively liberal, the person on the bed was the emperor's adopted daughter. Her identity was too special, and even the royal doctors were not allowed to see her face, let alone this random doctor who had come from nowhere. Fan Xian was a little disappointed. I heard that the royal physicians have determined that you have tuberculosis? The one who answered him was still the head maid. That Miss Lin seemed a little weak. She lay on the bed without saying a word. Yes. Fan Xian thought for a moment and felt that he had some confidence. After all, tuberculosis was the same as tuberculosis in his previous life. Although he had not brought along a first aid kit like the other great powers, there were still many ways to treat it. So he continued to ask, "Does the lady often feel tired? And he coughs a lot?" Yes. Are you getting thinner? Yes. Do you often feel hot and humid? Yes. Fan Xian was a little annoyed. This servant girl's mouth was too fast. He rolled his eyes and asked, "Do you often sweat?" Yes. The principal maid still rushed to answer. But Fan Xian did not seem to hear. He touched the soft palm of the hand that had stretched out from the bed curtain and found that it was indeed slightly moist. Miss Lin had never imagined that the doctor outside would be so bold. She shyly and anxiously pulled her hand back. Fan Xian had moved so quickly that the three girls outside the bed did not see it. Fan Xian frowned. "You haven't coughed blood yet, have you?" "I've already started coughing. It was better in the spring, but it started again a few days ago." Seeing that the young doctor had accurately described the symptoms, the servant girl stopped looking down on him and replied with a trace of anxiety and hope. "Yes." Fan Xian thought for a moment and then said seriously, "The lady really does have tuberculosis." Hearing him say something that everyone already knew, the servant girl bit her lip and wanted nothing more than to throw the doctor out. Yi Linger glared at him and Fan Ruoruo felt a little embarrassed and lowered her head. Fan Xian did not care. He stood up and went to the desk to find a pen and began to write a prescription. When he was done, the servant girl took it and looked at it. It was still the same lily and gold soup, but there were two more ingredients, purple pearl grass and black mountain jasmine, and one more ingredient, skullcap. She frowned and asked, "Skullcap is bitter and cold. It purges fire and strengthens Yin, but it hurts the qi too much. Can it be used?" As the saying goes, a long illness makes a doctor. This servant girl had seen different doctors treat the lady over the years. She was very familiar with the prescription for tuberculosis, so she could point out the problem immediately. Fan Xian looked at her and couldn't help but feel a little more admiration. He explained, "As long as the patient is healthy, there should be no problem. First, use a strong medicine and then take it slowly." The servant girl looked at him and said somewhat angrily, "The lady has tuberculosis and her body is very weak. How can she stand it? Fan Xian smiled and was not angry. Since the lady has already coughed up blood, then the disease is a little serious. She needs to recover first and then use medicine. Should we use a strong medicine first, or should we recover first? Yilinger was a little confused. Fan Xian coughed twice. From now on, give the lady a bowl of goat's milk every day. Remember to drink it raw. This was a folk prescription he had heard in his previous life, and it was very effective. He asked again, how is the lady's diet? The servant girl was thinking about the goat's milk when she heard this. She proudly replied, every day she has plain porridge and side dishes. She has never had to endure any meat. Fan Xian was furious. She was already so sick and yet they were still like this? She was a weak little girl and yet they didn't let her eat well. That was too much. Seeing the strange looks in his sister and Yilinger's eyes, he realized that his anger was unreasonable. Given Miss Lin's status, it was impossible for anyone to skimp on her food. There must be some other reason. He laughed self-mockingly and asked, why do you eat like this? The three girls looked at him as if they were looking at an idiot. Everyone in the world knew that tuberculosis patients avoided meat. Fan Xian was not educated to know this, so he stubbornly said, we must let the lady eat something good. She must no longer avoid greasy meat. She must drink goat's milk, and her daily diet must be more varied. If she can't get used to it for a while, mash a tael of raw yam and coarse barley rice, cook it until it's cooked. Then crush half a tael of persimmon biscuit, mix it well and drink it. After half a month, use the prescription I gave you earlier. As he spoke, the others frowned. No one dared to listen to him. At this moment, the old nanny who had stopped the three of them earlier walked in with her hands on her waist. She didn't know what she had just done for her to be so exhausted. Her voice was a little weak as she said, why did you come in? The servant girl greeted them with a smile and explained, this is the doctor Miss Yi invited. The lady agreed to let them take a look. The old nanny was a bit unhappy and said, the imperial physicians in the palace also come once every 2 days to give a diagnosis. What's so special about this doctor? The servant girl laughed. It is indeed a little strange. They have already determined that the lady has this illness, and they want us to prepare delicacies for the lady every day. When the old servant girl heard this, she shook her head furiously. She said that this could not be done. If the lady's illness was delayed, what could they do? After 2 or 3 sentences, her expression changed and she hurriedly excused herself. A smile flashed in Fan Xian's eyes. He said to the servant girl, this medicine must be used in conjunction with what I said before, otherwise it will have no effect. The servant girl still refused to listen to him, which made Fan Xian very angry. He thought that if he could one day be with the lady, he would make the bed for her. He said helplessly, I have some ready-made pills here. Take a few first. If the effects are good, you should believe me. The pills may be good, but the meat must not be eaten. The servant girl was really stubborn. Fan Xian gritted his teeth in anger, but he didn't know what to do. When he coughed up blood, she coughed up blood. When he clenched his teeth, she clenched her teeth. Behind the gauze curtain, the beautiful girl lying weakly on the sickbed heard the doctor's voice outside. She was so anxious that she didn't know what to do. That voice was so familiar. It was clearly the young man she had met in the side hall of the Temple of Qin. She didn't know why he had come to her home, nor did she know how he had become Sir Fei's student, but Miss Lin's hands tightly gripped the corner of the silk quilt. Her cute white teeth bit her lower lip. She was very excited, and an unhealthy but exceptionally beautiful red stained her cheeks. What should she do? She knew that the person was outside the curtain, but she didn't know how to meet him. She was so worried that her sister loved him to death. Hearing that the conversation outside was coming to an end, and that the owner of the voice was about to leave, the girl finally couldn't take it anymore. She sat up and leaned against the headboard of the bed. Using all her strength, she shouted in a voice as small as a mosquito. Wait. Hearing the voice behind the gauze curtain, the 4 people outside had completely different reactions. The servant girl walked over first and asked in a low voice what was the matter. Yilinger looked concerned. Ruoro thought about how her brother had risked his life to come here today in disguise, but had no way of seeing Miss Lin. She unconsciously looked at her brother's expression, and unexpectedly she saw a dumb goose. When Fan Xian heard the words, wait, he was dumbfounded. He turned into a dumb goose, staring stupidly at the bed. It was as if he wanted to see the woman's face through the gauze curtain to confirm the voice he had just heard. In the Temple of Qin, he had heard the white-clothed girl speak, especially that one sentence. Actually, it was just that one sentence. Who are you? Those 3 soft words in the temple of Qing left a deep impression on him, and he had never forgotten them. Fan Xian immediately knew who the person behind the veil was. A wave of ecstasy rushed into his brain, numbing him for a short time. He didn't know what to do. After the shock, he immediately thought of Huang Lixing's song. The sound waves are too strong. If I don't sway, I'll be knocked to the ground. So he swayed a little but immediately sobered up, and forcibly suppressed the urge to lift the veil in front of the bed. Miss, what is it? The servant girl asked in a low voice beside the bed. Yilinger also walked over, frowning. Chin, lie down first. Why sit up? This doctor, what you said earlier seemed to be very reasonable. The girl behind the gauze seemed to be anxious about how to phrase her words. To see in person, perhaps. The doctor will be more confident. The servant girl heard her mistress say this, but she remembered the rules. She could only look at Yilinger for help. Yilinger had already begun to doubt Fan Xian's medical skills, so she said a few unnecessary words of advice. But she could not resist Miss Lin's insistence, and her heart ached. She knew that she and her sister did not have much time left, so she did not want to let go of any hope. She sighed and reached out to pull the gauze curtain. At that moment, the hateful old nanny came upstairs for the 3rd time. Seeing this scene, she was shocked and wanted to pull Fan Xian away. Fan Xian was angry. She was really troublesome, he thought. He glared at her like an angry god of thunder. Wherever his gaze landed, the old nanny clutched her stomach and fled. Fan Ruoruo naturally knew that her brother's gaze could not hurt. It was the laxative still working. She couldn't help but cover her mouth and laugh. At that moment, there was also a smile on Fan Xian's lips. He watched the gauze curtain slowly open, waiting for the moment when the 2 of them would meet. The muslin curtains were pulled apart, revealing a beautiful girl with fair skin, bright eyes, and a blush on her cheeks. Just like that, she appeared in front of everyone. As if there was no one else around, the 2 pairs of gentle but resolute gazes met. Fan Xian's eyes were filled with joy and happiness, while Miss Lin's eyes were filled with confusion and disappointment. Fan Xian immediately realized that he had put on makeup today. This fiancé, whom he had only met once, had no way of recognizing him on the spot. He couldn't help but smile and feel helpless. Miss Lin sat down with the help of the servant girl. Looking at the unfamiliar young doctor in front of her, she could not hide her disappointment. But gradually, her brows furrowed as if she were recalling something. It seemed that she had discovered something from the young doctor's smiling eyes. Yilinger suddenly felt that Sir Fei's student gaze was very annoying. Why are you just standing there? She urged. Fan Xian smiled and walked up to her. He looked closely at the beautiful face that he had been thinking about for a few days. Looking at the unhealthy blush, he felt a deep sense of pity. You must eat and take the medicine according to the method I just told you, he said gently. Do you understand? Hearing the voice again and seeing this completely different face, Miss Lin felt a little dizzy. She put her arm on the bed and said softly, Sorry to trouble you. When they left Miss Lin's boudoir, Miss Lin politely thanked the young doctor and Miss Fan. She knew that Miss Fan was very likely to become her sister-in-law in the future, so it was inevitable that she had some inexplicable emotions in her heart. When she looked at the young doctor again, her heart was even more agitated. The voice was clearly his, but why wasn't it him? Seeing the young doctor about to walk out the door, Miss Lin was very anxious, but there was nothing she could do. As a princess in name, insisting on seeing the doctor was already an extremely bold move. Did she have to ask him if he had been to the temple a few days ago? Did he see a girl in white? Did he remember that chicken leg? Forget it. It was clearly not that person. It was just that the voice was somewhat similar. It seemed that she had slept too deeply these days and remembered that voice too much. She had fallen into a mental barrier. Just as the girl was worrying about her gains and losses, Fan Xian suddenly stopped in front of the door. He turned around with a strange smile and said, You have to drink goat's milk and you have to eat some meat. If you're hungry, prepare a few more chicken legs to eat. Miss Lin's eyes brightened. But I haven't had a good appetite these days. I often feel nauseous. Don't worry. Vomiting will become a habit. Fan Xian found that his future wife was a clever person and was delighted. You can ventilate the room during the day, but remember to close the windows at night. Yilinger and the servant girl wondered if there was something wrong with the doctor's brain to say something like that. On the carriage back to Fan Manor, there were no outsiders, only Fan Xian and Fan Ruoruo, who was secretly laughing next to him. Fan Ruorwo saw that her brother was trying very hard to resist the urge to laugh. "Laugh if you want to," she said. "Why hold it in?" As soon as she said this, a burst of joyful laughter came from the carriage. It was so loud that it startled the people on both sides of the road, and frightened Ting Zijing, who was standing guard in front. Things in this world are so coincidental. Seeing her brother so happy, Fan Ruorwo couldn't help but feel happy for him. "I didn't expect Miss Lin to really be the girl you met at the temple. It is a coincidence." Fan Xian scratched his somewhat itchy eyebrows. "In the future, don't call her Miss Lin. Call her sister-in-law." Fan Ruorwo teased him. "You just got married in October. Isn't it too early to call her sister-in-law? And yeah, you know that the Prime Minister and Princess Royal don't like you. Didn't you also think about rejecting this marriage?" Fan Xian laughed a little embarrassedly. "That was then and this is now. I must marry that girl. Forget the Prime Minister and the eldest princess. Even if the director of the Overwatch Council returned to the capital, I wouldn't care." Fan Ruorwo suddenly asked curiously, "Today is actually the first time I've seen Lin, sister-in-law?" She couldn't help but laugh. "Although sister-in-law is beautiful, she's not as beautiful as you described her last time." Fan Xian was startled. "Isn't that beautiful?" he asked solemnly. "No," Fan Ruorwo said objectively. Fan Xian thought about it and felt a little lost. After a long time he said, "Is this what they call, beauty is in the eye of the beholder?" "Brother, I think I understand what you mean. But where is she sure from?" Fan Ruorwo was eager to learn. At this time Fan Xian's mind was filled with Miss Lin. He had long since lost the fine tradition of being his sister's teacher. He casually said, "She sure is a girl who sells tofu in Danzhou Harbor. She's very beautiful and her skin is very white." Liar. Fan Ruorwo was a little dissatisfied. She found that ever since her brother had confirmed that his future sister-in-law was his sweetheart, he had been in a daze. Fan Xian comforted her. "Why would I lie to you? When you were little, you snuck out of the manor with me to go to the market. She sold tofu there at the time, but you were too young to remember." Fan Ruorwo was skeptical. Looking back on today's events, Fan Xian felt deeply moved. How is this time travel? This is clearly a romance novel. Miss Lin's surname was Lin Wanner, and her nickname was Yi Chen. She had grown up in the palace and didn't have many friends. Her background was a bit strange, so although she knew that her father was the current prime minister, she didn't have many opportunities to meet him. She was closer to her uncle, especially after her uncle had arranged a marriage for her 4 years ago. Even her mother had been deprived of the right to manage her, so she had some relaxed and carefree days. Unfortunately, these days were a bit lonely. Yi Linger often went crazy with her brothers in Dingzhou. Even in the capital, it was not convenient for her to enter the palace, so there was no one by her side who she could talk to intimately with. At the beginning of the year, for some reason, her uncle had someone reveal her relationship with her father. At the time, she thought that her uncle was preparing to embarrass her father and force him to resign. Who would have thought that things would turn out differently? Instead, the matter of the marriage, which had been put aside 4 years ago, was brought back to the table. His name was Fan Xian, and he was the illegitimate son of the Minister of Revenue in Danzhou. A bitter smile appeared on Lin Wanner's lips. It seemed that he had also had a hard life. He had never seen his parents since he was young. But why did he insist on her marrying him? Could it be that her identity was so dishonorable that she had no choice but to marry Fan Xian? She wondered what Fan Xian looked like. Lin Wanner couldn't help but think of the doctor during the day. A smile rose to her lips and she covered her mouth as she laughed. That man was really funny. He had thought of a way to sneak into the side courtyard. This was a side courtyard of the royal family, and it was heavily guarded. How did he do it? Pretending to be Sir Fei's student? What a daring man. But then she remembered that this man had come with Miss Fan. Could it be that he had some sort of relationship with Fan Manor? Then he must know about her marriage to that young master of Fan Xian. Heavens! If he knew about this, why did he come to see me? Why did he say those things to me? 2 blushes appeared on her cheeks, and they were as beautiful as the clouds. The servant girl who was making the bed looked at the princess, who was leaning against the headboard. She couldn't help but be a little dazed. She giggled and asked, "Miss, what are you thinking about? These last 2 days I've seen you smile for no reason at all." Lin Wanner was a little embarrassed. "Can't I even smile?" The servant girl stuck out her tongue and walked to the window to close it. It was already late at night and it was time to go to bed. Lin Wanner thought of the young man's last words during the day and said in a low voice, "Go and get some incense." The maid thought, don't we have more? However, he did not say anything and went downstairs on his own. Lin Wanner walked over to the window and placed her slender fingers on the bars of the window frame. Should I close it or not? She thought. Thinking of her illness and the fact that she had been promised to a stranger called Fan Xian, Lin Wanner's heart ached. Her fingers secretly tightened and she shut the window tightly. Chapter 83. It was a spring night, the perfect time for roosters to crow and dogs to steal. A black shadow floated down from the back wall of Fan Manor like a leaf. It landed without a sound, brushed off the dust on its body, and disappeared into the night. This person was, of course, Fan Xian. As he walked through the night, he wondered why there was no such thing as a true qinggong that could cover a distance of 30 feet. Every time he climbed up the wall, he would get covered in dust. Although the capital was bustling, there were very few places that still had lights at night. For example, there was Walong Alley where there was a night market and a variety show. Another example was the pool by the Lujing River, where there were lights on the riverside in the middle of the night to welcome guests onto the boats. Most of the other streets were dark. Only the faint lights from the houses next to them would occasionally shine through the cracks in the doors of the houses and onto the streets made of limestone, forming a thin, dark line. Fan Xian walked through these indistinct and invisible lines, running in the dark. The cool night wind hit his slightly hot face and it felt very comfortable. It didn't take long before he arrived at the alley next to the royal courtyard that he had visited earlier in the day. Looking at the small building in the courtyard, he frowned. There had to be some palace guards around. In Wu Zhu's words, he was at most a 7th-level Nigong cultivator, and a 3rd-level Nigong cultivator with exquisite control. If he wanted to rush in without alarming these masters, he had to be very careful. He had to see Miss Lin. Although he didn't know her full name, he had to tell her who he was, who she would marry in the future, and most importantly, her illness. It was quiet in the dark night. The sound of the night watchman had just started, and it would not be heard again for a while. Occasionally there would be the sound of frogs croaking, which was slightly out of season. Fan Xian stood quietly behind the wall at the mouth of the alley, adjusting the jinqi in his body. He let the tyrannical jinqi slowly cover his entire body. With his lower back as the pivot, he perfectly controlled every part of his muscles and consciousness. He didn't know if Wu Zhu was beside him, but he knew that he couldn't rely on Wu Zhu for the rest of his life. No matter how powerful Uncle Wu Zhu was, there would be times when he could not take care of her. Otherwise, her mother would not have died back then. He rubbed his hands on his clothes to make sure there wasn't too much sweat on them. Then he found an inconspicuous spot on the back wall of the royal courtyard. Jinqi slowly seeped out of his palms, and then retracted from the edge of his palms, forming a small depression. Just like when he was climbing the cliff outside Danzhou Harbor, he easily attached himself to the wall and slowly climbed up. This wall was 2 meters high, and it would be difficult for an ordinary expert to jump over it. Moreover, the wall was smooth, so the Imperial Guard's defense here was the weakest. No one would have guessed that the person who came to steal the incense today was actually a Spider-Man. Climbing to the top of the wall, Fan Xian put one hand on the wall and used the other to wipe away the cold sweat on his forehead. He thought, why did he have to take such a big risk just to see his wife? But now was not the time for regret. Looking up at the sky, he saw that Mei Yuer was about to disappear into the clouds, and he couldn't help but feel happy. The silver light suddenly dimmed, and with a whoosh, Fan Xian had already landed silently in the garden. Like a leopard cat, he burrowed into the dense thicket, using the trees to hide his tracks. This entire series of movements changed from a straight fall to a rush forward. Surprisingly, it didn't make too much noise. It was all thanks to the strict training Wu Zhu had given him in Danzhou. In reality, there weren't many guards in the courtyard, and it was almost midnight, so they were even more lax. He could hear that there seemed to be someone still awake at the front door, but there was no one patrolling the garden. Fan Xian let out a sigh of relief, and carefully walked to the bottom of the small building. Raising his head, he found that the lights in the building had long been extinguished, and it was completely dark. He wondered if she had fallen asleep. The door downstairs was closed, and he didn't know if the old nanny would still be poisoned and wake up in the middle of the night to pay her respects. So Fan Xian forced a smile and gave up on this path. Turning outside the building, he slowly used the jinqi in his hands to grip onto the wooden pillar and climbed up. When he reached the top, the second floor of the wooden pavilion protruded out. It was about 2 feet long. Fan Xian let out a light breath and stretched out his hand to feel around. He felt a small crack, and using his index and middle fingers, he swung his body and was suspended in the air. Using his waist and abdomen as leverage, he swung up like a bat and stuck tightly to the outside of the window. Fan Xian believed that the girl in the window must have understood the meaning of the last words he had said during the day, so with a face full of confidence and a smile, he gently pulled the window. It didn't move. He used a little more strength and pulled the window again. It still didn't open. Lin Wanner had gone to bed early, but she couldn't sleep. She lay under the soft blanket, her hands clutching the corners of the blanket. Her eyes were wide open in the dark, staring at the ceiling above her head. No one knew what she was thinking. She immediately heard the movement outside the window, and her heart tightened. She didn't know what to do. She had never imagined that the young man would be so daring as to sneak into the royal courtyard in the middle of the night. She should have called for help, but she thought that if the guards rushed over, the beautiful young man would probably be sentenced to death. So she couldn't bear to do it. Biting her lip, she didn't know what to do. It's a good thing the window is closed. She comforted herself, thinking that as long as the young man couldn't come in, he would naturally retreat. That way she wouldn't have to face a situation she didn't want to think about, and the young man wouldn't have to bear such a heavy crime. Unfortunately, things didn't go as she wished. There was a soft creak from the window and it was pushed open. A young man dressed in black flipped in from outside, holding a slender dagger painted black. Lin Wanner saw this scene through the gauze curtain, and she unconsciously wanted to cry out. But when she saw that face, that clean and untainted face she had seen on the altar of the Temple of Qin, she didn't know why, but she swallowed her cry. Fan Xian moved quickly, without a trace of the shyness a young boy should have in his first love. He turned around and closed the window, then walked to the bedside and pulled back the gauze curtain. A faint fragrance began to spread through the room. Lin Wanner felt a little dizzy, but after smelling the faint fragrance she immediately woke up. Only then did she realize that the young man had used a sleeping incense. She was shocked. Could this person be the legendary rapist? Endless regret began to well up in Lin Wanner's heart. She opened her mouth, ready to call for help. Fan Xian did not feel this way at all. He was just happily preparing to wake the girl up. Unexpectedly, when he looked, the girl was still awake. A frightened expression appeared in her originally confused eyes, and her mouth was wide open. Was she preparing to call for help? He immediately woke up. His body floated and he knelt on one knee on the bed. He covered Lin Wanner's mouth with one hand. His palm touched her soft lips and it felt ticklish. Don't shout, don't shout. This was the first time in Fan Xian's life that he had stolen incense, and he couldn't help but feel a little inexperienced. It's me, it's me, it's me. Lin Wanner seemed to see that the young man didn't mean any harm. She gradually calmed down. Fan Xian moved his hand away and said quietly, "Don't shout." Lin Wanner suddenly thought of the two strange fragrances and asked anxiously, "What did you do to my servant girl?" Because the servant girl was sleeping on the bed next to them, she should have woken up after the commotion. Fan Xian explained quietly, "It's nothing. This incense has the effect of calming the mind. It's not harmful to the body. I just wanted her to sleep." Lin Wanner felt a little more at ease. Looking at the clean, smiling face in front of her, she was a little happy but also a little afraid. Who was this person and what was his identity? Seeing the fear in her eyes, Fan Xian felt sorry for her. "Don't be afraid. I'm the doctor from this morning. Didn't I say before I left that I would come back tonight?" Lin Wanner suddenly smiled sweetly. "Didn't you tell me to close the window?" Seeing this beautiful woman suddenly smile, Fan Xian's heart skipped a beat. Looking at her lips again, he had other thoughts. At that moment he suddenly felt something cold on his neck. A dagger gleaming with cold light. The hilt was in Lin Wanner's hand, and the blade rested on Fan Xian's neck. Lin Wanner looked at him and suddenly her heart softened. "I don't care who you are. If you leave now, I promise I won't pursue this matter." With the cold dagger on his neck, Fan Xian's face was still smiling. He looked at her and said softly, "I'll leave in a moment. I just came to see you today." After saying this, he took out a package wrapped in oiled paper from his bosom, completely ignoring the sharp knife wound on his neck. Lin Wanner, on the other hand, was afraid that she would accidentally cut him, and subconsciously moved her sword a little further away. Fan Xian tore open the oil paper and took out a fragrant chicken leg. Bringing it to her lips, he laughed. "That day at the Temple of Qin, I ate one of your chicken legs. I knew you liked it, so I brought it here for you." Lin Wanner didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She wondered what kind of time it was for this young man to be so mischievous. If the guards found out a strange man was in her room, both of them would be finished. With a trembling voice she said, "Please leave." Fan Xian was going to play along with Xiaoyan's routine, but seeing Miss Lin in such a panic, his heart softened. Don't be afraid. I won't hurt you. As soon as he said this, he felt something was wrong. Why did it sound like the lines of the rapists in the wuxia novels of his previous life? As expected, Lin Wanner's expression changed. She put the dagger to his neck and said in a trembling voice, I don't care who you are. If you try to insult me with words, I'll cut you. Fan Xian realized that sneaking into a woman's room was indeed something that would ruin her reputation. But looking at Miss Lin's determined expression, he couldn't help but wonder if she was going to murder her husband. Chapter 84. I've been thinking about you a lot these days. Fan Xian ignored her and continued, Ever since I saw you at the Temple of Qing, I've been wanting to see you. Lin Wanner was embarrassed. What nonsense are you talking about? She gritted her teeth. I'm already engaged. Besides, how could you sneak into a girl's room in the middle of the night? That's impudent and rude. You're engaged to the Fan family. I know. Fan Xian looked at her with a smile. Lin Wanner thought of the first time she met this young man. She thought of the complicated feelings they had when they looked at each other in silence. She felt a pang of pain in her heart. Since you know, why haven't you left? Do you really want someone to kill you? Fan Xian stopped teasing her. He looked at her and said seriously, I am Fan Xian. The deathly silence went on for who knew how long. Fan Xian felt a little awkward. He saw a tear fall from the corner of Lin Wanner's eye. She quickly wiped it away and said in a low voice, Mister, please behave yourself. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. I'm telling the truth. What do I have to do to make you believe me? Lin Wanner looked at his face. After a long moment of silence, she said in a low voice, You are Mr. Fan? Fan Xian smiled and nodded, but Miss Lin still had a look of disbelief on her face. The moon in the sky had long since broken free from the shackles of the clouds, revealing its bright and beautiful face. Its faint light shone on the earth, and some light shone through the window, illuminating the man and woman on and under the bed. It really is me, Fan Xian said softly. Wanner couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her emotions were in turmoil and she couldn't help but start coughing. She didn't even know where the sword in her hand had gone. As she coughed, she asked, You're the Fan family's underground fighter? Fan Xian couldn't help but laugh. Seeing how weak she looked, he felt sorry for her and reached out to hold her wrist. He passed some jinshi into her body and carefully adjusted her pulse. Hearing the words underground boxing, he laughed bitterly. I only did it twice. Lin Wanner gradually began to believe him. Happiness appeared on her face. She asked again, You are the 10,000 sorrowful autumn guest? Fan Xian continued to smile bitterly. I wrote it in a hurry. It doesn't count, it doesn't count. Wanner's eyes gradually brightened. You, it's really you? Fan Xian wanted to go crazy. He wanted to cry but had no tears. Today I came with my sister. If I wasn't Fan Xian, how could my sister help a strange man visit her future sister-in-law? Lin Wanner thought he was right. She covered her mouth and laughed, but then she thought of another problem. So you went to the temple last time to see me? She asked angrily. When she thought about how this young man had kept everything in the dark, Lin Wanner was incomparably angry. It was this hateful fellow who had caused her to worry about her gains and losses these past few days. She had even thought about all those impolite things. She wanted nothing more than to beat this young man up. Fan Xian looked at her expression and knew what she was thinking. He quickly explained, I swear to God, when I first met you in the Temple of Qing, it was a coincidence. I didn't know who you were until I saw you this morning. He looked at Lin Wanner's beautiful face with a smile and said softly, This is all fate. Lin Wanner shyly lowered her head and pulled her wrist from Fan Xian's grasp. Then why did you come with Sister Fan to see me today? She asked in a low voice. Fan Xian was startled. Was he supposed to tell her that after he cured Miss Lin, he was going to elegantly run away from the marriage? He wouldn't dare say that even if he was beaten to death. He could only softly reply, I heard that Miss Lin's health wasn't good and I couldn't see her, so I came to see her in secret. How could I have known that it was the chicken leg girl I met in the Temple of Qing? Lin Wanner lightly spat. Why did he have to call her by her name so badly? Fan Xian smiled and pointed at the chicken leg next to him. Do you want to eat it now? He asked. Lin Wanner couldn't help but cover her mouth and laugh. Go ahead. I'm not that greedy. Fan Xian's ears suddenly twitched. He heard someone get up from downstairs. It seemed they were about to come upstairs. He frowned. Someone's coming. Lin Wanner panicked. Even if he was her future husband, if someone saw him, how could she face others? She pushed him. Then get out of here. Fan Xian had worked hard for half the night. How could he just leave like that? With a smirk on his face, he flipped over and crawled under the covers. The bed was huge and the covers were huge. The room was dark, so if someone were to look from outside, they wouldn't be able to see anything out of the ordinary. Realizing that Fan Xian had crawled under the covers, Lin Wanner turned pale with fright. But before she could do anything, she heard someone coming up. It was the old nanny who had had diarrhea during the day. Lin Wanner was embarrassed and anxious. She slid under the covers and turned her body to the outside, pretending to be asleep. The old nanny looked around and didn't see anything out of the ordinary. She mumbled a few words and felt a little dizzy. It seemed she was sleepy again, so she turned around and went downstairs. Lin Wanner elbowed behind her. She lowered her voice and said shyly, "She's gone. Hurry up and get out." It wasn't easy to get a kiss. Fan Xian, who was thanking the old nanny for the first time, had no reason to leave right away. He said, "I'm sleepy. Lie down a little longer." Lin Wanner now knew that her future husband was a scoundrel. She said angrily, How can I do that?" Fan Xian laughed and moved closer to her body. His nose took in the faint scent of her body. He felt relaxed and happy. Why not? This, if word gets out, how can I face others? Lin Wanner shyly buried her head in the covers. Feeling the heat behind her, she moved forward a little. Fan Xian sighed. He was afraid that the girl would be so scared that she would move out of the bed. That would be a cold. He could only get up. Full of desire, he sat down on the edge of the bed and held the girl's slightly cold hand. Lin Wanner struggled but couldn't break free. She let him be, thinking that as long as he wasn't lying on the bed, it was already a great blessing. Fan Xian looked at her slightly closed eyes and said quietly, "I've realized that my luck in this life has been too good." Chem? Lin Wanner opened her eyes curiously and looked at him with her clear and bright eyes. "I fell in love with a girl. But before I fell in love with her, she was already my fiancée. For something like this to happen, doesn't that mean I'm very lucky?" Fan Xian explained with a smile. His elegant face was full of joy. Lin Wanner asked curiously, If what? Forget it. It's nothing." Lin Wanner bit her lower lip and suppressed the doubts in her heart. "There's something else I need to talk to you about." Fan Xian looked at the faint traces of sweat on her forehead and said with heartache, "What I said during the day was true. Right now you have to take good care of your body. Clear porridge and small dishes are good for your stomach, but for tuberculosis they are of no help." The girl had been pleasantly surprised today, and her crystal heart had long been trembling. When she heard the word tuberculosis, she immediately thought of her own illness, and instead became depressed. Her emotions were agitated, and her face darkened. She said sorrowfully, "The royal doctors have taken a look and said that this illness is not easy to treat. Although it's just tuberculosis, it won't kill people, but if I really am with you in the future, I'm afraid it will tire you out." Fan Xian suddenly looked at her seriously. "Sheep's milk, chicken drumsticks, the medicine I prescribed, and the pills I left for you in a bit. Take them slowly according to the method I told you, and your body will definitely recover." Lin Wanner sighed. The royal doctors can't cure it. They can only drag it out year by year. Fan Xian smiled. "Of course my medical skills are not as good as the royal doctors. Even if my teacher were in the capital, I'm afraid he would only use some unorthodox methods. Your status is noble, and I'm afraid the nobles in the palace wouldn't dare use them. But the diet I mentioned is something the royal doctors can't think of. Plus, as long as you recover, when my teacher returns to the capital, he will certainly be able to get his hands on a lot of precious herbs. When that time comes, there will be hope for your illness. Diagnosis and treatment are one part of it, and medicine is another. Don't be fooled by the countless rare herbs in the palace, but the truly good ones are probably not as good as my teacher's collection." Hearing his earnest words, Lin Wanner was moved. "Thank you for your trouble, Master Fan," she said quietly. Fan Xian was surprised. Why did she have to be so formal? After all, he didn't understand a woman's mind. Once she confirmed that the man in front of her was her future husband, Lin Wanner's words naturally became more reserved. This was a woman's characteristic. He was a little surprised. "You still call me Master Fan?" he asked with a smile. Lin Wanner was curious. "What should I call you?" Suddenly understanding what he meant, she blushed and turned away from him. In a voice as small as a mosquito, she said, "That will have to wait until after we are married, then I'll change it." What I mean is, you can call me Brother Fan, Fan Xian said, stifling a laugh. Lin Wanner realized that she had been tricked. Embarrassed and angry, she wanted to reach out and hit him, but then she remembered that she had only met this man twice, and that he was still a stranger. She hesitantly stopped. Fan Xian looked at her thin shoulders. After we are married, let's go to the Tsang Mountains. It's higher up there and there are hot springs. It's the best place for you to recuperate. Hearing the word married, Lin Wanner blushed slightly, but she still nodded. She didn't understand what he meant by higher up. Thinking of something else, she quietly asked, "Is Master Fei really your teacher?" "Yes." Fan Xian smiled. "I always thought that since Master Fei worked for the Overwatch Council, he would be a very low-key person. Who knew that he was so famous in the capital?" Lin Wanner laughed. "He was a meritorious minister during the northern and western expeditions. Of course he was famous. But people were afraid of his poison, so they always avoided him." She looked at Fan Xian's beautiful face and asked curiously, "How could Master Fei be your teacher?" Fan Xian shrugged. "Miss Lin, there will probably be a lot of trouble in the future. Right now, I don't even understand it myself. If you marry me in the future, I'm afraid there will be a lot of trouble. You have to think about it carefully." Lin Wanner smiled and shook her head. She knew that after this marriage, there would be a lot of exchanges and redistribution of benefits. At first, she had been very resistant to it and her illness had worsened. But now that she realized that the heavens had eyes, that the young master of the Fan family was the one in front of her, she was already full of gratitude to the heavens. What other extravagant expectations could there be? Thinking of the recent uproar in the capital, she said, "Master Fan, sometimes I really don't understand. You are the son of Count Sinan and a student of Master Fei of the Overwatch Council. How can you be so proficient in poetry?" "That's right, was that line really written by you?" Fan Xian didn't see any doubt on her face. He just asked a simple question. "What's the matter?" he asked curiously. A hint of anger appeared on Lin Wanner's face. "The Empress Dowager liked that line very much, but there have been rumors in the palace that you copied the last 4 lines from a poet of the previous dynasty." She trusted the man in front of her, so she was a little angry. Only then did Fan Xian realize that the aftermath of the poetry conference had not yet settled. The lawsuit with the Guo family had not yet been resolved, and now there was this kind of accusation. But he had copied Du Fu, so he wasn't really angry. Instead, he saw that his fiancée looked tired and he felt sorry for her. So he gently patted her hand and told her to stop talking. "I'll come to see you often. But, what if someone finds out?" "Yes, I'm really worried that if someone finds out, my strange uncle might kill them all. That's a problem. I'll have to talk to him tomorrow." Fan Xian's hair stood on end, thinking that such a terrible thing could really happen. Lin Wanner looked at his face, refusing to close her eyes. But in the end, she couldn't stop herself from falling asleep. The next morning, Lin Wanner woke up in a daze under the warm blankets. She opened her eyes, rubbed them, and found that they were particularly energetic. The maid smiled sweetly and bowed, then prepared to help her up to wash up and dress. Lin Wanner suddenly remembered what had happened last night, and cried out in surprise. "Where is he?" the maid asked curiously. "Oh." Lin Wanner said anxiously, "Did you hear anything last night?" "No, miss," the maid replied seriously. Lin Wanner walked to the window. Her long black hair hung straight down to her hips, and she was dressed in white. She looked very beautiful. She looked out the window, but there was no trace of that person. She couldn't help but wonder if she had just had a dream last night, a dream that she really wanted to make real. As her imagination ran wild, the maid walked up to her with a half-torn package of oiled paper. She laughed and said, "Miss, you're eating again. Be careful that the nanny sees it and reports it to His Majesty. Hurry up and close the window. Don't let the wind blow." Lin Wanner took the package and found that there were a few pills in her belt. Her heart warmed. She looked out the window and saw that the garden had grown greener. Even after the window was closed, it seemed to be unable to hide the boundless spring that was prying open the window and escaping. Chapter 85. We, the common people, are so happy today. Really King happy. Fan Xian was drinking soy milk and chewing on fried dough sticks in the flower hall, feeling very comfortable. He had to admit that he was lucky. He was already dead, but he had come to this world to live again. He was born pitiful, with his mother dead and his father not wanting him, but later he found out that the people who killed his mother had all been killed. As a son, he wanted to take revenge, but there was no way to do so. Although his father had some problems, at least he didn't show an attitude that he couldn't stand. Another thing was that he had planned to copy books, earn some hard-earned money, and live a good life in this world. But he hadn't thought that there would be a pile of shiny things waiting for him to disdain. Most importantly, if he wanted to make this quick money, he would have to go against his will and accept the arrangements of those big shots, marrying a woman he had never met, and in the end, that woman was the one he liked. There were people who were lucky and there were people who were always lucky, but Fan Xian didn't believe that his luck was as good as his. Seeing that he was in a good mood, Lady Lu didn't react, but Fan Xizha was interested. After his mother left, he asked in a low voice, "Big brother, why are you so happy? I've already found a place for the shop. When are you going to take a look? Didn't you invite the shopkeeper?" Fan Xian was in a good mood, and his face beamed with happiness. "I told you to take care of this yourself, and if there's anything wrong, come find me. If you think you're too young and can't handle it, there are so many people in the manor, you can pick any two of them." Fan Xizha shouted, "You're the boss, the books are yours and you've paid for half of it. You have to take a look." Hearing the words boss, Fan Xian said happily, "Fine, then I'll go in a couple of days. Didn't father beat you a few days ago and forbade you from missing class? Come pick me up and I'll take you around the capital." "No, I'll offend people if I go out with you. I don't want to go to court every day." Fan Xian finished the soy milk in his bowl in one gulp and smacked his lips full of dregs. He was somewhat dissatisfied. "If this bookstore does well when you grow up, there will be a lot of business waiting for you to do." Fan Xizha didn't understand. He scratched his head and left. Fan Ruoruo listened quietly at the side. She smiled and said, "Have you decided to accept this marriage?" "I have no choice but to obey my parents' orders." Fan Xian sighed. In the end, he did not have the talent to be funny. He shook his head and smiled. "I must get married. However, the things that come with marriage are a bit troublesome. I have to offend so many people for no reason, and I might not even be able to truly grasp those things. No matter how I think about it, it doesn't seem worth it." Fan Ruoruo knew that her brother was talking about the royal business, and was worried for him. After all, the eldest princess had been in charge for so many years, and no one knew how much the prime minister and the crown prince had profited from it. If this business was to be handed over to Fan Xian in the future, it was necessary for him to take over and check the accounts. Perhaps from the palace treasury to the royal merchant house, many people would be in trouble. She frowned and said, "What if I don't check the accounts?" "It's fine if you don't want to check the accounts, but you have to seal up all the old accounts. If the dirty water from the past splashes onto us, we're done for. And most importantly, if this source of income is cut off, some people will be very angry. Otherwise, I'll just marry Miss Lin and give up the business. After all, this was the result of my father's discussion with His Majesty. If I ask my father to step back now, His Majesty won't be too angry." Fan Xian shook his head. Thinking of his father's expression that night, he knew that his father had a fanatical obsession with taking back his mother's business. Although he didn't know where this obsession came from, it would be very difficult for his father to give up this opportunity in front of him. And he didn't want to give it up. After all, it was left behind by his mother, that woman. It belonged to him. Why should the royal family benefit from it? According to the palace, after he married Lin Wan, it would take a few years before he could personally take care of it. But being closer to the flesh always made his nose feel better. That was why Fan Xian treated the business of the bookstore as a proper business. On one hand, he was familiar with it, and on the other, he wanted to prove to some people that he had a mind for business. Could it be that someone will use some unusual methods? Fan Ruoruo asked worriedly. Fan Xian thought for a moment and replied, "Although I've never met the eldest princess, nor have I met any of the important people in the palace, I think that since she was able to manage the palace treasury for 10 years, no matter what her personality is, she must be a smart person. In the current situation, if I were to be killed, regardless of whether she did it or not, many people would be watching her. Perhaps the emperor doesn't care whether I live or die, but he certainly won't tolerate someone secretly breaking his decree. As an emperor, the most important thing is his own dignity. It just so happens that I'm entangled in a lawsuit and can't leave the capital. If someone makes a move against me in the capital..." He shook his head. "That would be too stupid." Fan Ruoruo looked at him with admiration. "Brother's analysis makes sense. Don't look at me like that." Fan Xian looked at her helplessly. "You trust me more and more, girl. I'm not an immortal, just an ordinary person. There are bound to be many things that we don't expect." Fan Ruoruo was a little worried when she heard this, but Fan Xian was fine. After all, Uncle Yi Luyun was always hidden in the shadows. If someone wanted to touch him, they could only do so if the traveling Yi Luyun suddenly returned to the capital. At noon, surrounded by Ting Zijing and a large group of guards, Fan Xian ran to the Fan family's private school to see Fan Xizha. It would have been fine if he hadn't seen him, but once he did, he almost fainted from anger. In the classroom, the children of the Fan clan were all laughing and playing, completely disregarding the old master in front of them. A few of the bolder ones even dipped their brushes in ink and splashed them in front of them. Not only did they stain the walls, but even the corners of the old master's clothes were stained. The old master's face was ashen with anger, but he didn't know how to be angry. The families of these naughty children were quite influential. Although their parents often urged them to respect their teachers, once they were in the private school, these youths changed. Some of the more despicable ones, relying on the strength of their servants, not only did they hang around in the private school, but they often committed immoral acts on the streets. Fan Xian poked his head through the door and took a careful look. He saw that Fan Xizha was relatively well behaved, sitting at a desk in the corner, writing something. The servant assigned to him by the family was squatting next to him, serving him tea. It seemed that he wasn't paying attention to the teacher, but at least he hadn't done anything out of line. Fan Xian had actually overestimated his younger brother. If Fan Xizha's mind hadn't been tied up by something even more interesting, he feared that he would have been even more impudent than the unworthy children in the room. Fan Xian called Fan Xizha out of the room and asked with a calm face, "This is where you study?" Fan Xizha didn't know why he was unhappy and replied angrily, "Yes, what about it? You should be the leader." Fan Xian had great faith in his leadership skills. Furthermore, in the entire Fan clan, Count Sinan's family was the most powerful, so Fan Xizha should have a special position among the children. Fan Xizha scratched his head. "They listen to what I say. That's good." Fan Xian continued, "Go in and teach those rascals a lesson. Make sure they listen to the teacher." Fan Xizha seemed to be in a daze. Don't respect the teachers? Fan Xian's eyebrows furrowed. He thought back to when he was in Danzhou, whether it was the teacher in charge of the school or the teacher Fei Jia, he had always respected them. Hearing the noise in the room getting louder and louder, he shouted angrily, "If you dare be like them, I'll slap you." Fan Xizha didn't know why Fan Xian, who had been so gentle lately, would suddenly provoke him. He glared at him and roared, "What right do you have to slap me?" His manservant and a few servants surrounded him. They were already familiar with young Master Fan, but when they heard that he was going to hit their young master, they were eager to protect him. They glared at Fan Xian fiercely, and the manservant took advantage of his familiarity with Fan Xizha and began to curse. Fan Xian frowned. Ting Zijing and a few guards walked up and mercilessly beat the servants of the house. The servant boy who had cursed was slapped countless times in the face. The people who followed Fan Xian were the direct subordinates of Count Sinan. They did not care about the servants in the manor, who were several ranks below them. Now that they were with Fan Xian, they were able to beat up the son of the current government minister without incident. They walked the streets with the wind in their eyes, and they did not hesitate to attack. The lesson was over. The servants looked at Fan Xian with faces full of fear and pain, and retreated timidly. The manservant's cheeks were red and he couldn't stop crying. Fan Xian looked down at Fan Xizha's frightened face and said softly, "I didn't say I would slap you. But if you do something wrong, I will slap you." "As for what? It's simple. You can't beat me in a fight and you don't dare complain to your father. If you do something wrong and challenge me, wouldn't that be asking for a slap?" Seeing that Fan Xian didn't seem to have any intention of hitting him, Fan Xizha let out a sigh of relief. He was still the son of an influential family who didn't care about his servants, and he didn't take Fan Xian's beating of his own men too seriously. Although he felt that he had lost some face, it seemed that following Fan Xian had its benefits. Thinking back to his nature as a businessman, he realized that it was better not to offend Fan Xian. "Go in and tidy up the order inside. I'll wait for you outside. Didn't you say you wanted to go look at the shop?" With that, Fan Xian waved his sleeves and walked out the door of the private school. The people of the Fan clan who were waiting outside couldn't help but click their tongues in wonder when they saw what had happened. They thought that the illegitimate son of Count Sinan was so powerful that he dared to bully the legitimate young master of Count Sinan's household in broad daylight. They looked at him with fear. Fan Xian didn't pay any attention to them. He sat on the bench outside the door and waited. Not long after, several miserable cries could be heard from inside the private school, as well as the loud sound of slaps. Fan Xizha's arrogant voice could be heard. "Behave yourselves. If you dare to be disrespectful to the teacher again, I'll slap you." These words were not much different from what Fan Xian had said. It seemed that young Master Fan was venting all the anger he had suffered at his elder brother's hands on his fellow clansmen. This time there was a ruckus. The Fan clan's groom, servants, who had been standing guard outside the private school, heard their master's cries of pain in the classroom. They glared fiercely at Fan Xian and rushed in. Fan Xian was afraid that Fan Xizha would be at a disadvantage. He gave Ting Zijing a look, and Ting Zijing and a few guards rushed in with the crowd. After a while, Fan Xizha was dragged out. Fan Xizha was not satisfied with the beating. He waved his fists and scolded, "Don't be afraid, don't be afraid. These people wouldn't dare to offend us." It was just as he said. The servants rushed in, but they only dared to protect their master. They didn't dare to fight back. It seemed that Count Sinan's manor had a special place in the Fan clan. After beating the people, Fan Xian grabbed his brother by the neck and carried him to the carriage, leaving the mess he had created. Ting Zijing frowned. "Young master, although the people in the clan are becoming more and more unreasonable, they are still old people in the capital. We still need their help. Offending too many people isn't necessarily a good thing." Fan Xian laughed bitterly. "What are you afraid of?" He thought to himself that perhaps these clansmen did have power, but he was about to marry the princess, and the emperor would be his brother-in-law. What was there to be afraid of? If he didn't teach these little bastards a lesson, he wouldn't be able to vent his anger. "Did it feel good?" he asked Fan Xizha. Fan Xizha was a little puzzled. "That's right. I often beat people up, but it never felt as good as today." "Why is that?" The resentment he felt at being taught a lesson by his brother had long since dissipated without a trace during the process of his heroic beating. "It's simple. You need to find a reason to beat people up. It's like fighting a war. If you have a perfectly honorable reason, then you can fight without any psychological baggage. Even when we attacked Northern Wei, didn't we first say they violated our borders?" Fan Xian continued. "It's all the same. We have to be righteous. Righteous. Do you understand?" "I don't understand," Fan Xizha replied sincerely. Chapter 86. Arriving at the bookstore on Dongchuan Road, Fan Xian and the others took a good look and found the location to be quite good. Transportation was convenient, and it was not too far from the Imperial College. Students from all over the Kingdom of Qing who were preparing to take the exams passed through here every day. The most important thing was that this place wasn't too crowded. In this way, it was more convenient for the princesses of the princes' mansions and the young ladies of the official families to send their personal maids to buy books. Fan Xian nodded and walked in with Fan Xizha. They were met by the servants of the manor and bowed. "Mr. Cui, sorry to trouble you." Mr. Cui forced a smile. "I say, young masters, this bookstore does not make a lot of money a year, and yet it requires so much effort. It is not worth it." Fan Xian knew that these former officials of the Ministry of Revenue did not care about a business that was only worth a few thousand taels of silver. He smiled and explained, "If my brother likes it, then let him do as he pleases." He did not expect to keep this a secret from Count Sinan, so he asked the servants of the manor to help. Since his father allowed Mr. Cui to help, it was tantamount to tacitly allowing his two sons to cause trouble outside the manor. They talked in a room in the back hall. Fan Xizha bit the shaft of his writing brush, calculating something. Once an account book was placed in front of him, he would immerse himself in it, forgetting everything else. While they were talking, the shopkeeper from Qingyu Hall also arrived. This shopkeeper looked honest and sincere. His eyes were not bright, but they were clear. Fan Xizha was somewhat satisfied and went to talk to him about the bookstore. Fan Ruoruo had already given Fan Xizha the first 60 chapters of Dream of the Red Chamber. Mr. Cui had sent someone to Wansong Hall to keep an eye on the printing, so there should not be any problems. Fan Xizha kept pushing Fan Xian for the later chapters, preparing to make a big splash in the capital. These days, Fan Xian was not in the mood to copy books, so he kept pushing it off. After deciding on a time for the opening of the bookstore, and confirming that the approval from the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council would be in their hands, they found that there was nothing else to do in the back room. When the time came, they would buy some classics from Wansong Hall, and with Story of the Stone as the main focus, it seemed that they were just waiting to collect money. As for the workers, they were all handled by the shopkeeper of Qingyu Hall, so the Fan family did not have to worry. Fan Xian wondered why everyone trusted Qingyu Hall so much. When he finally had the chance to be alone with the shopkeeper, he gently asked, "Shopkeeper, what is your name?" The shopkeeper replied with a smile, "Your surname is Yi." Fan Xian's heart trembled. He repeated, Yi? The shopkeeper seemed to have noticed Fan Xian's strange expression, and replied with some confusion, "Yes, there are 17 shopkeepers in Qingyu Hall, and they all have the surname Yi. Everyone in the capital knows this. Master Fan? All of you have the surname Yi?" Fan Xian frowned and asked, "How are you related to the Yi family from 20 years ago?" The shopkeeper was a bit surprised. He looked at Fan Xian, and a sense of vicissitudes came over him. "After so many years, I thought the young people of today had long since forgotten about the Yi family. That's right, we were all shopkeepers of the Yi family back then. Later on, the Yi family ran into some problems, and all of their businesses were lost to the palace. We were supposed to leave and find our own way out, but for some reason the court didn't allow us to run our own businesses. That's why we're in such an awkward situation now. We can only manage the businesses for others, but we can't buy our own shares. This is how Qingyu Hall came to be." Fan Xian looked at the shopkeeper again. He knew that the shopkeeper had been his mother's subordinate, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of familiarity. He asked curiously, "After the Yi family was in trouble, did the court not?" He didn't finish his sentence, but the shopkeeper understood what he meant. They said to cut weeds and eliminate roots. Since the court had taken over the Yi family's property, they had no intention of keeping these old people alive. The shopkeeper didn't know why, but he also felt that the young master of Fan Manor in front of him was very familiar. He thought for a moment and replied, "We also felt that it was strange. So these years we have lived in fear. The court did not allow us to leave the capital, so we were afraid of what would happen one day. Take me to Qingyu Hall one day." Fan Xian suddenly found a place in the capital that was related to his mother's past, and he couldn't help but be surprised. He grabbed the shopkeeper's shoulder and said, "I have many things to ask you." After returning to Fan Manor, Fan Xian sat in his father's study and told him what had happened that day. He asked curiously, "Qingyu Hall, are they really the old people of the Yi family?" "Of course they are." Fan Jian stroked his short beard as if reminiscing about the past. He said slowly, "These people are actually not simple. Back in the day they were all shopkeepers of the Yi family in various provinces. However, your mother offended the nobles and met with misfortune. You know how glorious the Yi family was back then. For a time the court panicked. If the Yi family fell, I'm afraid the Qing kingdom would be in chaos for many decades. So in the end they came up with a compromise. First they took the Yi family back to the royal family. At least in name they cut off the possibility of the officials taking advantage of the situation to extort them, and then Fan Xian cut him off. How did the people who killed my mother die in the end? This was a question he had always wondered about. Fan Jian looked him in the eye and said coldly, "You are young. You probably don't remember what happened in the Qing kingdom 14 years ago." "I remember." Fan Xian frowned. 14 years ago, it seemed that someone wanted to change the world, to pull His Majesty down from the throne. So in the end a lot of things happened. There was a month of killing in the capital and most of the original nobles were killed. Blood flowed, and the heads of the nobles were placed on the city walls for a mile. That was the so-called month of blood in the capital. Although I have never experienced it, I have heard Teacher Fei talk about it many times. "Correct," Fan Jian said in a cold voice. "During this purge, all those who participated in the plot against the Yi family were killed by us." Fan Xian noticed the word, "we" in his father's words. "Were we?" he asked carefully. "Me and Shin Pingping, of course." Fan Jian smiled. "This was probably the most successful operation we have ever carried out in the 20 years we have followed His Majesty. The Fan family also used this incident to rise to power, and the Overwatch Council, because of the terrifying role they played in this incident, firmly established their influence among the officials." Fan Xian sighed. "So the cause of this incident was Father and Sir Qin seeking revenge for my mother. What happened next?" Fan Xian asked about the Yi family. "As I said before, the Yi family's businesses were taken into the palace treasury. This was the best way to stabilize the court at the time. The court was full of civil and military officials, and they could not come up with a more effective suggestion." Fan Jian explained, "The problem was with those shopkeepers. They were all taught by your mother. Although they were far from being as wise as your mother was, if they were left alone, who knows if a second Yi family would appear. So His Majesty decided to gather them all in the capital. He had them train some people to take over those businesses, but he did not allow them to own real businesses. That is how the capital's famous Qingyu Hall came to be." "If you want to do business, they are a good choice," Fan Xian said sadly. "Because of this reason, These shopkeepers were forced to stay in the capital for more than 10 years. How tragic. Father, if we use these shopkeepers, won't it attract the attention of the court? Fan Jian shook his head. Using the shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall has always been the favorite method for the private businesses of the various princes. The court doesn't care about this, but if you want to gather all 17 shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall, it doesn't seem necessary. If the court is really afraid of this, why did they not kill all of them in the beginning? Fan Xian asked his own question. Fan Jian looked at his son and smiled. When something happened to your mother, I was fighting with His Majesty in the west. Qin Pingping went to the border between our country and northern Qi to carry out a secret mission. Halfway through, he came to his senses and returned to the capital. That is why this happened. If we have already returned to the capital and these people are still killed, then you underestimate your father's power. Lu Shi knocked on the door and the father and son stopped talking. Fan Jian let her in. Seeing the bowl of fruit juice in Lu Shi's hands, Fan Xian knew that it was late, and that it was time for his father to go to bed. He stood up and prepared to leave. But Count Sinan waved his hand for him to stay, and Lu Shi went to rest. Before Lu Shi left, Fan Xian caught a glimpse of worry in her eyes, and knew that she was worried about her husband's health. He couldn't help but frown, thinking that this woman really did have some affection for his father. It was a pity that she was too cruel to do such a thing all those years ago. He knew that if his father did not want him to leave, he must have something important to tell him, so he listened attentively. Tell me about the recent situation in the court. Count Sinan picked up the warm fruit juice and slowly drank it. I know you still resent the fact that Lu Shi sent people to poison you 4 years ago. Fan Xian was startled. He did not understand what the situation in the court had to do with Lu Shi, nor did he expect his father to so bluntly bring this matter up. For a moment he did not know what to say. The two matters are actually related. Fan Jian knew what his son was thinking. 4 years ago Lu Shi made her move because Xijia was getting on in years, but he was becoming less and less serious. I had not been able to bring her up, and she could not help but feel a little hopeless. In a moment of blindness she made that decision. But more importantly, it was because she had entered the palace once and received a guarantee from someone that once you died, Fan Xijia would inherit everything of the Fan family. Entered the palace? Whose guarantee could make her disregard her grandmother's life? Fan Xian asked coldly. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.